The girl couldn't have been more than 13, her thin frame trembling in the twilight shadows of Ethan Cole's barn. Dirt streaked her hollow cheeks, and her eyes, wide with terror, darted toward the road like a hunted animal expecting its predator. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They sold me. My own father sold me to settle a debt, and the man who bought me. He's coming." Ethan's blood ran cold as she clutched his sleeve with desperate fingers. "I'm too young to be a wife." In that moment, standing in the fading Wyoming light, Ethan Cole faced a choice that would define everything he believed about right and wrong. Before we continue with Mara's story of survival and one man's stand against a system that treated children as property, I invite you to stay with us until the very end. If this story moves you, please hit that like button and comment with your city below. I'd love to see how far Mara's journey reaches across the world. The September wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant pine across Ethan Cole's cattle ranch, a sprawling piece of Montana territory that had been his sanctuary and his prison for the past 3 years. Since Sarah died bringing their stillborn son into the world, Ethan had found a kind of hollow peace in the rhythms of ranching, the predictable cycles of feeding, mending fences, moving cattle from one pasture to another. The work kept his hands busy and his mind mercifully blank. He was replacing rotted boards on the barn's eastern wall when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the hammer's echo. A whimper. Animal, he thought at first, perhaps a fox caught in the brush. But then it came again. Unmistakably human, laced with a terror that made every muscle in his body tense. Ethan set down his hammer slowly, his weathered hand moving instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip. 3 years of solitude had taught him caution. The frontier attracted all kinds, drifters, deserters, men running from debts or crimes or both. He'd learned to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts screamed that something was desperately wrong. He found her crouched behind a stack of hay bales near the back of the barn, her small body folded in on itself like a wounded bird. For a moment, Ethan could only stare. She was a child, no other word fit, with tangled brown hair that might have been pretty if it wasn't matted with dust and what looked like dried blood. Her dress, once probably pale blue, hung torn at the shoulder, revealing bruises that made Ethan's jaw clench so hard his teeth ached. "Don't hurt me," she breathed, pressing herself further into the corner. "Please, I'll go. I'll leave right now. Just don't. I'm not going to hurt you." Ethan kept his voice low, the same tone he used with spooked horses. He raised both hands, showing them empty. "I'm Ethan Cole. This is my ranch. You're safe here." The girl's eyes, startling green against the dirt on her face, searched his for lies. She couldn't have been more than 13, maybe younger. Too young for the fear etched into every line of her thin frame. Too young for the way she held herself, coiled and ready to run despite obvious exhaustion. "I'm Mara," she whispered finally. "Mara Hutchins. From the settlement 12 miles east, I've been walking all night." Ethan crouched slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. "That's a long walk. You must be hungry, thirsty." She nodded, then seemed to catch herself, suspicion flooding back. "Why would you help me?" "Because you're a child alone in my barn, clearly running from something." He paused, measuring his next words carefully. "Or someone." Fresh tears carved clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. Her whole body began to shake, not with cold, though the evening air had turned crisp, but with something deeper, the kind of shaking that came from holding terror at bay for too long. "They sold me," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "My father, he owed money to Silas Crow, a lot of money, for freight contracts that went bad, and Mr. Crow, he said he'd forgive the debt if—" She couldn't finish, her throat working around the words that wouldn't come. Ethan felt something cold and furious settle in his chest. "If what, Mara?" "If I married his nephew, Vernon Crow. He's 32 years old and he has a ranch near Copper Creek, and Mr. Crow says it's all legal, says my father signed papers, says I'm Vernon's wife now and I have to go with him." The words spilled faster now, desperate and terrified. "But I never agreed. I never said yes. And when Vernon came to collect me, he grabbed my arm so hard and he smiled and said I'd learned to be obedient, and I ran. I just ran and ran until I saw your barn, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but I didn't know where else to go, and Mara, Ethan's voice cut through her spiral gently but firmly. Breathe, just breathe for me. She sucked in a ragged breath, then another. How old are you? 13. I'll be 14 in November. 13. The same age his son would have been if Sarah's pregnancy had come to term years before the one that killed her. Ethan's hands curled into fists against his thighs. Did this Vernon, did he hurt you? Beyond the bruises I can see? Understanding flickered in her eyes, followed by something like relief. No, not like that. I ran before he could. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, a childish gesture that hammered home just how young she was. But he will, I know he will. And everyone says it's legal because my father signed, but I don't want to be married. I'm too young to be a wife. The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Ethan had spent 3 years avoiding human connection, building walls around the raw wound of his grief. He told himself it was easier this way. No obligations, no vulnerabilities, no more chances for life to shatter everything he loved. But looking at this terrified child who'd fled through the night to escape a fate she never chose, he felt those walls crack. Come on, he said, standing slowly. Let's get you cleaned up and fed. Then we'll figure out what to do. Mara's eyes widened. You're really going to help me? Even though Mr. Crow is important and my father signed papers and… Papers or no papers, you're 13 years old and you never agreed to marry anyone. Ethan's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. That makes everything else irrelevant. In the ranch house, Ethan heated water on the stove while Mara sat at his rough-hewn table, her shoulders hunched as if she was trying to take up as little space as possible. The house still bore traces of Sarah, her blue curtains in the window, her mother's china in the cabinet, the quilt she'd been stitching when the sickness took her draped over the back of the rocking chair. Ethan had left everything exactly as it was the day she died, unable to change anything, unable to move forward. He poured the warm water into a basin and set it on the table with a clean cloth and a bar of soap. Washroom's through there if you want privacy. There's a lock on the door. Mara nodded but didn't move immediately. Mr. Cole? Ethan. Just Ethan. Ethan. She tested the name carefully. Why are you doing this? Most folks, when they hear Silas Crow's name, they look the other way. He owns the freight company, half the businesses in town, and he's got connections with the territorial government. Even the marshal doesn't cross him. Ethan settled into the chair across from her, the wood creaking under his weight. I had a wife, Sarah. She died 3 years ago, along with our baby boy. He would have been about your age now if he'd lived. He paused, the familiar ache of loss pressing against his ribs. I couldn't save them, but I can help you. Understanding softened Mara's frightened features. I'm sorry about your family. Me too. He gestured toward the washroom. Go on, clean yourself up. I'll fix something to eat. While Mara washed, Ethan worked mechanically, slicing bread, frying eggs and bacon, brewing strong coffee. His mind spun through possibilities, each more complicated than the last. If what Mara said was true, her father had essentially sold her to settle a debt. The law in the territories could be murky at best, dependent on whoever held the most power in any given county. And if Silas Crow controlled the freight, the businesses, and had the marshal in his pocket, legal recourse might be impossible. But Ethan had learned something in his years of grief and isolation. Sometimes right and wrong weren't written in law books. Sometimes a man just had to look at a situation and decide which side of the line he stood on. Mara emerged from the washroom looking younger and more fragile without the layers of dirt. The bruises on her arms stood out in stark relief, finger marks, clearly from a grown man's grip. Seeing them made Ethan's jaw clench again. Sit, he said, pushing a plate toward her. Eat. She fell on the food with barely restrained desperation, wolfing down the eggs and bacon so fast Ethan worried she'd make herself sick. He poured her a glass of milk, watered down the coffee, and waited until she'd taken the edge off her hunger before speaking. Tell me everything, from the beginning, and don't leave anything out. Mara wrapped both hands around the warm coffee mug, drawing comfort from its heat. My mother died when I was 7. Fever. After that, it was just me and my father and my 2 older brothers. We had a small homestead, but my father, he wasn't good with money. Always had schemes for getting rich, always borrowed to invest in something that would change everything. She took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. About 6 months ago, he borrowed from Silas Crow to buy into a freight contract. Said we'd triple the investment in a year, but the contract fell through. Bad weather, lost wagons, I don't know all the details. The point is, my father couldn't pay back what he owed, and the debt kept growing with interest. How much did he owe? $3,000. Ethan whistled low. That was more than most frontier families saw in 5 years. That's a hell of a debt. Mr. Crow gave him extensions, but the interest just made it worse. 2 weeks ago, Mr. Crow came to our homestead with his nephew Vernon and a lawyer from town. They had papers all drawn up. Her hands tightened around the mug until her knuckles went white. The papers said Vernon would marry me and the debt would be forgiven. A family arrangement, Mr. Crow called it. My father, he just signed. Didn't ask me. Didn't even look at me. Just signed his name and told me to pack my things. What about your brothers? Bitterness twisted Mara's young face. They said I should be grateful. That Vernon has a good ranch and I'd never want for anything. They said plenty of girls my age get married and I was being selfish and childish for making a fuss. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. When I said I didn't want to, my oldest brother slapped me and said I didn't have a choice. That I belonged to Vernon now, same as a horse or a piece of land. The cold fury in Ethan's chest solidified into something harder, sharper. When did you run? Yesterday. Vernon came to collect me. He had a wagon and he grabbed my arm. You can see the marks. And he said we'd have a proper wedding night once we got to his ranch. The way he smiled when he said it, she shuddered. I waited until he went to check on his horses. Then I just ran. I ran until I couldn't breathe and then I kept running. I knew they'd come after me, so I stayed off the road, traveled at night. I saw your barn and I thought maybe I could hide for just a few hours, catch my breath, and then keep going. Keep going where? I don't know. West, maybe. California. Somewhere they can't find me. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying this brave, terrified child who'd walked through the night to escape a fate she never chose. You do realize they're looking for you. Silas Crow doesn't strike me as a man who lets go of things easily. And if your father signed papers, I know. Mara's chin came up, defiant despite the fear in her eyes. I know it's probably hopeless. I know I'm just a kid with nothing and nowhere to go, but I had to try. I couldn't just let them. Her voice broke. The defiance crumbled and she was just a child again, exhausted and scared and utterly alone. Ethan made his decision. You're not going west, he said quietly. You're staying here. Mara's head snapped up. What? You're staying here on my ranch where I can protect you, and we're going to figure out how to break whatever legal hold they think they have over you. But Mr. Crow can go to hell. The words came out flat and final. You're a child, Mara, 13 years old. I don't care what papers your father signed or what deals were made. You never consented to any of it, and that matters. That has to matter. Tears spilled down Mara's cheeks again, but this time they carried something different. Not just fear, but a desperate, fragile hope. You really mean it? I really mean it. But why? You don't even know me. And if you cross Silas Crow, I know enough. Ethan stood, moving to the window where he could see the last light fading from the western sky. I know you're a child who shouldn't have to run through the night to escape being someone's property. I know you deserve better than what your family tried to do to you. And I know that if I send you back out there alone, I'll never forgive myself. He turned to face her, his expression grave. But you need to understand something, Mara. If you stay here, if we do this, Silas Crow will come. He'll bring his nephew, probably some hired men, maybe even the marshal with some trumped-up legal authority. It won't be easy or safe. There's a very real chance things could go bad. You could get hurt, Mara whispered, because of me. That's my choice to make. The question is, do you trust me enough to let me try? Mara looked at him for a long moment. This quiet widower who'd shown her more kindness in an hour than her own family had in weeks. She thought about her father's indifference, her brother's callousness, Vernon Crow's predatory smile. Then she thought about the way Ethan had knelt to make himself less threatening, the gentleness in his voice, the fury in his eyes when he'd seen her bruises. "Yes," she said, "I trust you." They spent the next hour planning. Ethan was pragmatic about their situation. Mara's disappearance wouldn't stay secret long. Her family would report her missing. Silas Crow would put out word that his nephew's bride had run away. Rewards might be posted. And when someone inevitably spotted her or word reached Crow that she was at Ethan's ranch, there would be confrontation. "The barn has a root cellar," Ethan explained, sketching a rough layout on a piece of paper. "It's hidden under the floorboards in the tack room. Sarah used to store preserves down there. It's cool, dry, and unless someone knows exactly where to look, they won't find it. If anyone comes to the ranch asking questions, you hide there. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Mara nodded, committing every detail to memory. "How far is it to the nearest town with a proper courthouse?" "Billings, about 40 miles east, but Silas Crow has influence there too." "What about a marshal who isn't in Crow's pocket?" Mara thought for a moment. "There's a federal marshal who rides through the territory sometimes, Marshal Garrett. My father mentioned him once, said he was too honest for his own good. I don't know where he's stationed, but he comes through every few months." It wasn't much, but it was something. If they could get word to a federal officer, someone with authority that superseded local corruption, they might have a chance. "There's also Mrs. Catherine Walsh," Mara added slowly. "She runs the boarding house in town. She's been out here longer than anyone, knew the territory when it was just trading posts and Cheyenne camps. People listened to her, and she's always been kind to me, used to give me peppermints when my father brought me to town." "Would she help?" "I think so. She doesn't like Silas Crow. I heard her argue with him once about how he treats his workers, called him a would-be tyrant with delusions of feudalism." A ghost of a smile touched Mara's lips. He turned purple. Ethan filed that information away. An ally in town could be valuable, especially someone with Mrs. Walsh's standing and brass. As full darkness settled over the ranch, Ethan showed Mara the hidden cellar. They descended through the trap door in the tack room floor, Ethan carrying a lantern. The space below was larger than Mara expected, about 10 feet square, with shelves still stocked with jars of preserved fruits and vegetables that Sarah had put up in what would be her last autumn. "There's blankets in that chest," Ethan pointed. "Water in those jugs. I refresh them monthly out of habit, and food enough for several days if needed. The air is good. There's ventilation through those gaps in the foundation." Mara looked around the space that might become her hiding place, her prison, her protection. "How long do you think before they come?" "A day, maybe 2 if we're lucky." Ethan met her eyes in the lantern light. "But they will come, Mara. Make no mistake about that." They climbed back up into the barn. Outside, an owl called through the darkness, hunting. Ethan secured the trapdoor, scattering straw and tools to disguise its location. To a casual observer, the tack room looked like nothing more than what it was, a cluttered workspace with saddles on stands and bridles hanging from pegs. Back in the house, Ethan set Mara up in the small bedroom that had been meant for the child he and Sarah never got to raise. The bed was narrow but comfortable, the quilt handmade. A small window looked out toward the eastern hills where dawn would break in a few hours. "Try to rest," Ethan said from the doorway. "You're safe tonight." Mara climbed into the bed, her small form nearly disappearing under the quilt. "Ethan?" "Yeah?" "Thank you for not sending me away, for believing me." Her voice was muffled by the pillow. "No one else did. Get some sleep, kid. Tomorrow we start figuring out how to make sure you never have to run again." But sleep didn't come easily for Ethan. He sat in his chair by the cold fireplace, his father's old rifle across his lap, and watched the shadows shift across the room. He thought about Sarah, about the son they'd lost, about 3 years of carefully maintained distance from the world's problems. He'd built his isolation like a fortress, telling himself it was better to feel nothing than to risk the pain of caring again. Now a frightened child slept in what should have been his son's room, and Ethan felt the fortress walls crumbling. He wasn't fool enough to think this would be simple. Silas Crow was powerful, connected, and used to getting his way. The law, such as it existed out here, would likely favor contracts and property rights over the protests of a 13-year-old girl. Ethan was just one man, a grieving widower rancher with no particular influence or authority. But he'd meant what he'd told Mara. Some things were just wrong, no matter what papers said or what powerful men demanded. Selling a child into marriage to settle a debt, calling it legal, didn't make it right. And Ethan had learned, in the hardest way possible, that life was brutally short and unpredictable. The only thing a man really had was his choice about what kind of person he'd be when it mattered. He checked the rifle's load, made sure his revolver was within easy reach, and settled in to wait for whatever dawn would bring. They came on the second day. Ethan spent that first full day after Mara's arrival preparing. He rode into town early, before most folks were stirring, and managed to speak briefly with Catherine Walsh. The boarding house keeper listened to his carefully edited explanation. A young girl had sought shelter at his ranch, running from an arranged marriage she never consented to, and her sharp eyes had narrowed with understanding. "Silas Crow's work, I'd wager," she'd said, not bothering to lower her voice despite the early morning diners in her establishment. "That man thinks money and contracts give him the right to arrange people's lives like their freight inventory. Can you get word to the federal marshal? Garrett, I think his name is? I can try, but he's riding circuit over 3 territories. Could be weeks before he comes through." She'd studied Ethan carefully. "You know what you're getting into, standing up to Crow?" "I've got a pretty good idea." "Then you're either very brave or very foolish." She'd patted his hand, her touch surprisingly gentle. "Probably both. I'll see what I can do. And Ethan? That girl is lucky she found you." The second thing Ethan did was ride out to his nearest neighbor, Jack Morrison, whose ranch bordered his own to the south. Morrison was a taciturn man who'd always respected the boundaries of Ethan's grief-enforced isolation, but he was also fair-minded and honest. Ethan explained the situation plainly, holding nothing back. Morrison had listened in silence, his weathered face unreadable. When Ethan finished, Morrison had spat tobacco juice into the dust and said, "Girl's 13? Yes. And she never agreed to marry this Vernon Crow?" "Never." Morrison nodded slowly. "Then Crow and that whole arrangement can go straight to hell. You need help when they come calling. You fire 3 shots in quick succession. I'll hear it and I'll come." It wasn't much, but knowing he had at least one ally within shouting distance made Ethan breathe easier. Now, watching dust rise on the eastern road, Ethan felt the calm that came before action settle over him. 3 riders approached, one in a fine black suit astride a gray gelding, one in rougher clothes on a bay, and one wearing a deputy's star on a buckskin. No wagon, which meant this wasn't Vernon come to collect his unwilling bride. This was something else. Reconnaissance, maybe. Or a first attempt at intimidation. "Mara," Ethan called quietly. "Company coming. Get to the cellar. Now." She appeared from the house where she'd been washing the breakfast dishes, her face going pale. But she didn't hesitate or argue. She ran to the barn as Ethan positioned himself on the porch, his rifle held loosely but ready. The riders drew up at the edge of his property, maintaining a careful distance. The man in the black suit, Silas Crow, Ethan assumed, sat his horse with the confidence of someone used to authority. He was perhaps 50, with silver threading through his dark hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cold calculation in his eyes. "Mr. Cole," Crow called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "I believe you have something that belongs to my family." Ethan didn't move. "Nothing here but cattle and horses, Mr. Crow. All mine." "Don't play games." Crow's affable tone hardened slightly. "Mara Hutchins ran away from her lawful obligations 2 days ago. We have reason to believe she's taken shelter on your property." "And what makes you think that?" The rough-dressed man on the bay spoke up. "Was tracks, Cole. Girl's prints leading right to your barn. We followed her easy enough once we knew to look." Ethan kept his expression neutral, even as he cursed inwardly. He should have thought of that, should have swept away any tracks. Too many years alone had made him sloppy about covering his tracks. "Even if there were a girl here," Ethan said carefully. I'm not sure she'd want to go back. Girl's got a right to choose her own path. The girl, Crow said with exaggerated patience, is 13 years old and the subject of a legal contract signed by her father. She has no more right to choose than a horse or a parcel of land. The law is quite clear on this matter. He gestured to the deputy. Deputy Barnes here has the authority to search your property for a runaway. Deputy Barnes looked uncomfortable but determined. It's true, Mr. Cole. Miss Hutchins is legally bound to Vernon Crow through her father's agreement. If you're harboring her, that's interference with a legal arrangement. I'll need to search your buildings. Ethan's grip on the rifle tightened imperceptibly. You got a warrant, deputy? Don't need one for a runaway. She's not a runaway slave or a criminal. She's a child who doesn't want to be forced into marriage. Crow's patience visibly frayed. She's property, Mr. Cole, bound by her father's legal signature. Now stop wasting our time. Hand her over or step aside and let Deputy Barnes do his job. The moment stretched taut. Ethan could feel it, the precipice, the point where words would fail and actions would have consequences that couldn't be undone. He thought of Mara hiding in the darkness below the barn, her heart probably hammering with terror. He thought of Sarah, of the child they'd lost, of 3 years spent hiding from life because grief felt safer than hope. Then he thought of Mara's voice, small and desperate. I'm too young to be a wife. No, Ethan said quietly. The single word fell like a stone into still water, ripples spreading outward. Crow's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? I said no, you're not searching my property, and you're not taking that girl anywhere. The rough-dressed man's hand moved toward his hip, but Crow raised one hand sharply, stopping him. Mr. Cole, I don't think you understand the severity of your situation. I own the freight company that transports your cattle to market. I have business relationships with every bank and merchant between here and Billings. I can make your life very, very difficult. Then I guess my life is about to get difficult. You're willing to lose everything over a girl you don't even know? I'm willing to do what's right. There's a difference. Crow studied him for a long moment, reassessing. Then his expression shifted, calculated charm replacing barely veiled threats. Mr. Cole. Ethan? May I call you Ethan? I understand you're a man of principle. I respect that. But you're also a practical man, I hope. This girl comes from a family of debtors with no prospects. Vernon is offering her a comfortable home, security, a position in society. Many would say she's lucky to have such an opportunity. Many would be wrong. She's 13 years old and she doesn't want to marry your nephew. That should end the discussion right there. She's a child who doesn't know what she wants. Her father, as her legal guardian, made the decision for her. That's how the world works. Maybe. Ethan's voice remained level, almost conversational. Or maybe the world works that way because men like you profit from it. Either way, she's not leaving this ranch unless she wants to, and something tells me she doesn't. The deputy shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Cole, I sympathize, I really do, but the law says a lot of things, deputy, doesn't make them right. You really want to be remembered as the man who dragged a terrified child back to be somebody's wife? Barnes flushed, but held his ground. It's not about what I want. It's about the law. Then change the law. But you're not taking her today. The rough-dressed man finally spoke up again, his hand resting openly on his gun now. You threatening a deputy, Cole? I'm declining to cooperate with what I consider an immoral order. There's a difference. Crow's mask of civility finally dropped completely. You're making a grave mistake, Mr. Cole. I'll give you until tomorrow morning to reconsider. If the girl isn't handed over peacefully, I'll return with enough men in legal authority to tear this ranch apart board by board. And when we find her, and we will find her, I'll make sure you're prosecuted for kidnapping, interference, and anything else my lawyers can think of. Your ranch will be seized, your cattle sold, and you'll spend the next decade in territorial prison. Is that really what you want? Ethan met his gaze steadily. Tomorrow morning, then. Bring whoever you want. My answer won't change. For a moment, violence hung in the air like summer lightning. Then Crow jerked his horse's head around viciously. Let's go. Mr. Cole needs time to contemplate his future, or lack thereof. The three riders wheeled away, dust rising in their wake. Ethan watched until they disappeared over the eastern rise. then finally allowed himself to exhale. His hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline and the knowledge of what he'd just committed himself to. He'd drawn a line in the dirt. Tomorrow, Silas Crow would cross it, and one way or another, everything would change. Ethan waited until the dust settled completely before calling Mara up from the cellar. She emerged pale and shaking, hay clinging to her dress from where she'd pressed herself against the earthen wall, trying to make herself invisible even in the darkness. "They know I'm here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They suspect. They don't know for certain." Ethan guided her back toward the house, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "But it doesn't matter now. We've got until tomorrow morning before they come back in force." Inside, Mara sank into a chair at the table, her thin arms wrapped around herself. "You should have let them take me. You heard what Mr. Crow said. He'll destroy you. He'll take everything. Let me worry about that. But it's not fair. You didn't ask for any of this. I just showed up and now, Mara." Ethan crouched in front of her, bringing himself to eye level. "Listen to me. What's happening to you isn't your fault. Your father made a choice, a terrible choice, but that doesn't mean you have to pay for it with your whole life, you understand?" Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I'm so scared." "I know. I'm scared too, if I'm being honest. But being scared doesn't mean we're wrong. It just means we're human." He squeezed her shoulder. "We're going to get through this. I promise." But even as he said it, Ethan felt the weight of that promise settle heavily on his shoulders. He'd made a stand against a powerful man with resources, connections, and the law on his side, or at least the local version of law. And he had maybe 14 hours to figure out how to back up his defiance with something more substantial than stubborn principle. He spent the afternoon fortifying the ranch as best he could. He moved weapons to strategic locations, his rifle by the front door, a shotgun in the barn, his revolver always at his hip. He checked ammunition supplies, filled water barrels in case of fire, and moved his most valuable possessions into the hidden cellar alongside Mara's hiding place. If Crow made good on his threat to tear the ranch apart, Ethan would at least save what he could. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the yard, Jack Morrison rode up the drive with two other men Ethan recognized, Pete Whitmore, who ran a small horse operation to the north, and Thomas Chen, a quiet man who'd homesteaded near the river 5 years ago and kept mostly to himself. "Heard you might be having trouble," Morrison said without preamble, swinging down from his saddle. Ethan met them in the yard, surprised and deeply moved. "Word travels fast. Deputy Barnes has a loose tongue when he drinks, and he stopped at the saloon on his way back to town." Pete Whitmore spat into the dust. "We heard Silas Crow is planning to come out here with a dozen men tomorrow. Heard it's over some girl." "A child," Ethan corrected. 13 years old. Her father sold her to settle a debt. Married her off to Crow's nephew, a man 3 times her age, without her consent. She ran and ended up here." Thomas Chen's normally impassive face darkened. "I have a daughter nearly that age, back in San Francisco with her mother's family. If any man tried to—" He didn't finish, but his hand moved to the knife at his belt. "Crow says he has papers," Ethan continued. "Says it's all legal. Gave me until morning to hand her over." "And you told him to go to hell," Morrison said with satisfaction. "More or less." "Good." Morrison planted his feet like he was settling in for a siege. "Then we'll be here when he comes calling. Let's see how brave Crow feels when he's not just facing one rancher." "You don't have to do this," Ethan said, though gratitude made his throat tight. "Crow can make trouble for you too." "Maybe," Pete said. "But I've been watching Silas Crow accumulate power in this territory for the past decade, acting like he owns everything and everyone, getting tired of watching decent people back down because he's got money and lawyers. About time someone stood up to him." Thomas nodded his agreement. "Besides, this is not about politics or business. This is about a child. That makes it simple." The 4 men stood in the fading light, and Ethan felt something shift inside him, the isolation he'd wrapped around himself like armor beginning to crack, letting in not just danger but also connection, community, the possibility that he didn't have to face everything alone. "Thank you," he said quietly. "All of you. It means more than I can say. Thank us when it's over, Morrison said. For now, let's make a plan. Crow won't come looking for a fair fight. He'll bring numbers and try to overwhelm you with legal authority and physical force. We need to be ready for both. They spent the next hour strategizing. Morrison would position himself in the barn with the shotgun, commanding a view of the main approach. Pete would take the high ground near the fence line, where he could see riders coming from half a mile out. Thomas would stay near the house, protecting Mara if things went badly. And Ethan would meet them on the porch, where he'd stood that afternoon, the place where he'd drawn his line. What about the girl? Thomas asked. Where will she be during all this? Hidden, Ethan said. The barn has a root cellar. Unless they tear up the floorboards, they won't find her. And if they do start tearing up floorboards, then we stop them, whatever it takes. The words hung heavy with implication. They all knew what that might mean, the moment when words failed and men reached for weapons. In the territories, such moments came more often than anyone liked to admit, and they usually ended in blood and regret. As darkness fell, Mara helped Ethan prepare dinner for the 4 men. Venison stew from the haunch Morrison had brought, biscuits, strong coffee. She moved quietly through the kitchen, her presence a reminder of exactly what they were preparing to fight for. The men ate mostly in silence, the weight of tomorrow's confrontation settling over them like morning frost. After dinner, Thomas told stories about his early years in California, working the gold fields before coming to Montana. Pete shared news from the northern ranches. Cattlemen talk about water rights and grazing lands. In the hard winter, everyone could feel approaching in the wind. Morrison contributed occasional dry comments that made even Mara smile. It was companionship, simple and genuine, and Ethan realized how much he'd missed it during his years of deliberate solitude. When the evening finally wound down and the men settled in various corners of the house and barn to catch what sleep they could before dawn, Ethan found Mara standing at the window of the small bedroom, staring out at the darkness. "Can't sleep?" he asked from the doorway. She shook her head. "I keep thinking about tomorrow. What might happen? All the ways this could go wrong." "That's natural. I'd be worried if you weren't scared." "Are you scared?" Ethan considered lying, offering empty reassurance, but Mara deserved better than that. "Yes, I'm scared that Crow will find a way to take you. I'm scared someone will get hurt. I'm scared that standing up won't be enough." He paused. "But I'm more scared of what kind of man I'd be if I didn't try." Mara turned from the window, her young face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "Mr. Morrison and the others, they have families, ranches, lives that don't involve my problems. If something happens to them because of me, nothing that happens tomorrow is because of you," Ethan interrupted firmly. "It's because your father made a choice he had no right to make, and because Silas Crow thinks money and contracts matter more than a child's welfare. Those men out there? They're here because they know the difference between legal and right. Don't take that from them by blaming yourself." She nodded slowly, but Ethan could see the guilt still eating at her. He understood it, that terrible feeling of being the cause of other people's suffering, even when the situation was beyond your control. He'd felt it after Sarah died, wondering if he'd somehow failed to protect her, if there was something he could have done differently. "Try to rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow's going to be hard, but we'll face it together. You're not alone anymore, Mara. Remember that." After she'd finally crawled into bed, Ethan made one more round of the property. The night was clear and cold. Stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. An owl called from the pine grove, hunting. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, at odds with the tension coiled in Ethan's chest. He found Morrison in the barn, checking the shotgun one more time in the lantern light. "You really think Crow will bring violence?" Ethan asked quietly. Morrison looked up, his weathered face thoughtful. "Hard to say. Men like Crow prefer to win through intimidation and legal maneuvering. Violence is messy, unpredictable, and can turn public opinion. But if he thinks he can get away with it," he shrugged, "desperate men do desperate things. And make no mistake, if Crow backs down tomorrow, it'll damage his reputation. He can't be seen as weak or indecisive, not with all the power he's accumulated. So yes, I think if pushed, he might turn to violence. Then we'll be ready." "Ready as we can be anyway." Morrison set the shotgun aside. "Can I ask you something, Ethan?" "Sure." "Why this? Why now? You've been holed up on this ranch for 3 years, barely speaking to anyone, not involving yourself in territory politics or problems. Most folks figured you'd die out here alone, still grieving. Then this girl shows up, and suddenly you're ready to take on Silas Crow and risk everything. Why? Ethan was quiet for a long moment, searching for words to explain what he barely understood himself. When Sarah died, I thought the best way to survive was to stop caring about anything. If I didn't care, I couldn't be hurt again. So I built walls and I hid behind them, and I told myself it was enough just to exist, just to keep breathing and working and moving through the days. He leaned against the barn wall, staring out at the night. Then Mara showed up, this terrified kid who'd been through hell and was still fighting, still trying to save herself. And I realized that existing isn't the same as living. That sometimes you have to care about something more than your own safety. That maybe, he paused, the words catching, maybe Sarah wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life afraid to feel anything. Morrison nodded slowly. She was a good woman, your Sarah. Smart, kind, tough when she needed to be. I think you're right. She wouldn't want you hiding from life. Doesn't make tomorrow any less terrifying. No, Morrison agreed. But terror means you're still alive, still capable of caring about outcomes. That's something. They stood together in comfortable silence until Morrison finally said, "Get some rest, Ethan. I'll take first watch. I'll wake you in a few hours." But rest didn't come easily. Ethan lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around him. He thought about the morning, about all the ways the confrontation could unfold. Best case, Crow would back down when faced with multiple witnesses and armed resistance. Worst case, worst case didn't bear thinking about in too much detail. Somewhere past midnight, he heard soft footsteps in the hallway. A moment later, Mara appeared in his doorway, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "I can't sleep," she whispered. "Me neither. Would it be okay if I just sat here for a while? I don't want to be alone." Ethan sat up, making space. "Of course." Mara settled into the chair by his window, drawing her knees up under the blanket. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice so quiet he almost missed it, she said, "My mother used to sing to me when I couldn't sleep. After she died, I'd try to remember the songs, but they kept fading, like losing her all over again." "What did she sing?" "Old ballads mostly, songs about brave knights and fair maidens and love that conquered everything." A bitter laugh. "Fairy tales. Nothing like real life." "Sometimes fairy tales exist to show us what we're supposed to aim for," Ethan said. "Not because life is really like that, but because we need to remember what's worth fighting for." Mara considered this. Is that what we're doing tomorrow? Fighting for the fairy tale? We're fighting for the truth that some things are wrong no matter what papers say. That children deserve protection and choice. That power and money don't give anyone the right to treat people as property. Ethan met her eyes in the darkness. Maybe that's not a fairy tale. Maybe that's just basic human decency. I hope you're right. I hope basic human decency is enough. So do I, kid. So do I. Dawn came too quickly and too slowly at once, the way it does before moments that will change everything. Ethan rose in the pre-dawn darkness, his body aching from too little sleep. He found Morrison already awake and alert, Pete stirring in the barn loft, Thomas checking his rifle near the house. They didn't speak much as they took up their positions. Words felt inadequate, insufficient to the weight of what they were about to face. Instead, they moved with quiet efficiency, checking weapons, scanning the horizon, preparing themselves mentally for whatever came next. Ethan sent Mara down to the cellar as the sky began to lighten in the east. She went reluctantly, fear and guilt warring in her young face. "Remember," Ethan told her, gripping her shoulders, "whatever happens up here, you stay hidden until I come for you personally. Even if you hear shouting or gunfire, you stay put. Understand?" "What if—" "No, what ifs. You trust me to handle this. Promise me." "I promise." She hugged him suddenly, fiercely. "Thank you for everything." Then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness below the barn floor, and Ethan was covering the trap door, scattering straw and tools to hide any trace of the entrance. The sun broke over the eastern hills, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Beautiful morning for an ugly confrontation, Ethan thought. He positioned himself on the porch, rifle in hand but held loosely, trying to project calm authority rather than aggression. They didn't have to wait long. At 7:30, a line of riders appeared on the eastern road. Ethan counted quickly, 11 men plus Silas Crow. Some wore deputy stars, probably pulled in from neighboring jurisdictions. Others looked like hired muscle, the kind of men who did Crow's dirty work for cash and didn't ask questions. Vernon Crow rode among them, a thick-built man with mean eyes and a cruel mouth. This was the man who'd grabbed Mara's arm hard enough to bruise, who'd promised her a proper wedding night with a predator's smile. The riders approached in formation, clearly meant to intimidate. They stopped at the property line, just as they had the day before, but this time the energy was different, harder, more dangerous, ready to escalate. Silas Crow rode forward slightly, his fine suit somehow still immaculate despite the dust of the ride. "Mr. Cole, I see you've had the night to reconsider. I'm hoping we can resolve this situation peacefully." "So am I," Ethan said evenly. "The girl stays here. That's the only resolution I'm offering." "Then you force my hand." Crow gestured, and Deputy Barnes rode forward with 2 other men wearing stars. "These are Deputy Harrison from Copper Creek and Deputy Walsh from Bridger. We have a warrant for the search and seizure of one Mara Hutchins, fugitive from lawful marriage contract. You will stand aside and allow us to search your property, or you will be arrested for obstruction." "On whose authority?" The voice came from the side of the house, and Catherine Walsh stepped into view, moving with the confidence of someone who'd faced down harder men than Silas Crow. She carried a leather satchel and wore her best dress, as if attending a formal hearing rather than a frontier standoff. Crow's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Walsh, this doesn't concern you." "On the contrary, Mr. Crow, it concerns me greatly." She moved to stand beside Ethan on the porch, opening her satchel. "I've taken the liberty of reviewing the legal documents you filed regarding Miss Hutchins. I've also consulted with Judge Hartwell in Billings. You remember him, I'm sure, from your failed freight litigation 3 years ago." A muscle jumped in Crow's jaw. "Judge Hartwell has no jurisdiction here." "Perhaps not, but he was very interested to learn about your creative interpretation of marriage contract law." She pulled out a sheaf of papers. "According to territorial statute, specifically the Homestead and Family Protection Act of 1868, a marriage contract requires the consent of both parties. A father's signature alone is insufficient for a minor child, particularly one under the age of 15. "That's absurd," Crow snapped. "I have precedent. You have custom, Mr. Crow, which is not the same as law. And Judge Hartwell was quite clear that what you're attempting would be classified not as marriage, but as human trafficking under federal statute." Catherine's voice remained pleasant, almost conversational, but steel ran through it. "Which carries rather serious penalties, I understand." Vernon Crow pushed forward, his face flushed with anger and something uglier. "That little bitch belongs to me. Her father signed her over fair and square, and I paid good money." "And there it is," Catherine interrupted smoothly. "You paid money. For a child. Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Vernon Crow. Deputy Barnes, did you hear that? This man just admitted to purchasing a human being." Barnes looked deeply uncomfortable. The other deputies exchanged uncertain glances. This was veering away from a simple fugitive recovery into murkier legal waters, and none of them wanted to be on the wrong side when it settled out. Silas Crow's mask of civility finally shattered completely. "Enough of this legal maneuvering. I don't care what some territorial statute says or what Judge Hartwell thinks. That girl was given to my nephew in a binding contract, and I will have her. Deputies, you will search this property immediately, and you will arrest anyone who interferes." "Actually," another voice called out, "they won't." A new rider appeared from the western road, a tall man in his 50s wearing a federal marshal's star and carrying himself with the authority of someone who didn't need to prove anything. Marshal Garrett, Ethan realized. Catherine Walsh had somehow gotten word to him. "Marshal Garrett," Crow said, recovering some of his composure. "This is a local matter. Federal law doesn't—" "Federal law absolutely applies when we're talking about interstate trafficking, coercion of minors, and violation of the 13th Amendment. Garrett rode forward slowly, his eyes moving over the assembled men with sharp assessment. Mrs. Walsh sent me a very detailed telegram yesterday. I've spent the past few hours reviewing the contracts you filed, Mr. Crow, and speaking with some of your business associates. Interesting pattern that's emerged. Seems this isn't the first time you've arranged marriages to settle debts. Found 3 other cases in the past 5 years, all involving minor girls, all from families who owed you money. The color drained from Silas Crow's face. So, here's what's going to happen, Garrett continued, his voice carrying absolute authority. You're going to turn around and ride back to town. Your nephew Vernon is going to come with me to answer some questions about his understanding of consent and legal marriage. And you, Mr. Crow, are going to present yourself at the courthouse in Billings within 3 days to explain to a federal judge why you shouldn't be charged with multiple counts of human trafficking. You can't. I have rights. This is persecution. This is justice, finally. Garrett's hand moved to rest on his sidearm. Now you can come peacefully, or I can arrest you right here for obstruction of a federal investigation. Your choice. The moment hung suspended, teetering on the edge of violence. Vernon's hand moved toward his gun. 2 of the hired men tensed. Ethan's finger found the trigger of his rifle. Then Deputy Barnes cleared his throat. Mr. Crow, I think we should listen to the marshal. This has gotten complicated. Complicated? Crow's voice rose to a near shout. You work for me, Barnes. I pay half your salary through what exactly? Garrett asked mildly. Please do continue. I'm very interested in hearing about financial arrangements between law enforcement and private citizens. Barnes flushed but held his ground. With respect, Mr. Crow, I'm a deputy under the territorial government, not your employee. And the marshal's right. This situation doesn't smell right. That girl is 13 years old. I've got a daughter not much older. If someone tried to do this to her... He shook his head. No, sir. I won't be part of it. One by one, the other deputies nodded agreement. Even the hired men were backing away from the confrontation, sensing that the wind had shifted decisively against their employer. Silas Crow looked around at the disintegrating support, at the federal marshal who held real authority, at the ranchers who'd stood their ground, at Catherine Walsh with her legal documents and connections to judges. He'd come expecting intimidation and numbers to carry the day. Instead, he'd found resistance, law that actually meant something, and the exposure of activities he'd thought were hidden. This isn't over, he said finally, his voice tight with fury. I have lawyers, connections. Then use them, Garrett said. In court, where they belong. Now collect your nephew and get off this man's property. The confrontation deflated like a punctured bladder. Crow wheeled his horse around viciously, Vernon following with murder in his eyes. The hired men scattered quickly, wanting no part of federal charges. Within minutes, the property was clear except for Marshal Garrett, Catherine Walsh, and Ethan's 3 neighbors who'd stood with him. Ethan found he was shaking, adrenaline and relief and disbelief all coursing through him at once. That's it? It's over? Not entirely, Garrett said, dismounting. There'll be hearings, legal proceedings. You'll need to testify, and so will the girl. Crow will fight this with everything he has, but the charges are serious enough that he won't be able to make this disappear quietly. He extended his hand. You did the right thing, Mr. Cole. Hard thing, but right. Ethan shook his hand, then Catherine's. How did you manage this? Catherine smiled. I've lived in this territory for 32 years, dear. I know who to contact and how to make things move quickly when necessary. The moment you told me about Miss Hutchins, I sent telegrams to every judge and marshal within 3 territories. Marshal Garrett happened to be closest, and he has a personal dislike of men who exploit children. Lost my own daughter to a forced marriage back east, Garrett said quietly. She was 14, tried to run, died in the process. His face hardened. I swore after that I'd never let it happen again if I could prevent it. So when Mrs. Walsh's telegram came through, I rode all night to get here. The weight of that statement settled over them all. This wasn't just about law or justice. It was about human stories, personal losses, and the connections that bound people together across grief and determination to do better. Can I... Ethan's voice caught. Can I tell Mara she's safe now? Bring her up, Garrett said. I'll need to speak with her, take her statement. But yes, Mr. Cole. Tell her she's safe. Ethan's hands were still shaking as he crossed the yard toward the barn, the morning sun warm on his shoulders, but doing nothing to ease the cold knot of tension that had been coiled in his chest since dawn. Behind him, he could hear Catherine Walsh offering coffee to Marshall Garrett and the others, her voice carrying that practiced hospitality that somehow made even a near-violent standoff feel manageable in retrospect. But Ethan's focus had narrowed to a single point: the hidden cellar beneath the barn floor where a terrified child had spent the past hour listening to raised voices and the threat of everything falling apart. He entered the barn, pulling the door closed behind him. The familiar smells of hay and leather and horse surrounded him, oddly comforting after the adrenaline spike of confrontation. In the tack room, he moved aside the scattered tools and straw, finding the concealed trap door exactly as he'd left it. "Mara," he called softly, lifting the door. "It's me. You can come up now." For a long moment, nothing. Then he heard movement in the darkness below, hesitant and uncertain. Mara's face appeared in the dim opening, streaked with dust and tear tracks, her eyes wide and haunted. "Is it really over?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "It's really over. Marshall Garrett sent them away. Crow's facing federal charges. You're safe." She climbed up slowly, as if her legs might not support her weight, and when she reached the barn floor, she simply stood there, swaying slightly. Ethan caught her elbow to steady her. "I heard shouting," Mara said, "and I was so sure they'd found me, that they'd tear up the floor and drag me out, and—" Her breath hitched. "I almost gave myself up. I almost came out on my own just to stop anyone from getting hurt because of me." "But you didn't. You trusted me to handle it." Ethan guided her toward the barn door, into the sunlight. "And look, everyone's fine. Morrison and Pete and Thomas are all safe. Catherine Walsh brought a federal marshal who actually cares about the law, and Silas Crow rode off with his tail between his legs." They stepped out into the yard where the others had gathered near the porch. Catherine saw them first, and her stern features softened into something almost maternal. "There she is. Come here, child. Let me look at you." Mara moved forward uncertainly, and Catherine took her gently by the shoulders, studying her face with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen too much suffering and learned how to recognize its marks. "You're braver than you know, Miss Hutchins. Running through the night alone, finding help, standing your ground even when you were terrified. That takes courage." "I don't feel brave," Mara said quietly. "I feel like I've been falling, and just now hit the ground." "That's shock," Marshall Garrett said, his gruff voice surprisingly gentle. "It'll pass. Your body's been preparing to run or fight for days now, and suddenly the danger's gone. Takes time for everything to settle back down." He pulled a small notebook from his vest pocket. "But I do need to speak with you, Miss Hutchins. I need your account of what happened, starting with when you first learned about this arrangement your father made." Mara's face went pale. "Will I have to see them again? My father, or Vernon, or—" "Not today. Eventually there'll be a hearing and you may need to testify, but that's weeks or months away. Right now I just need your statement for the record." Garrett's expression remained kind but professional. "I know it's hard to talk about, but your words matter, Mara. They'll help make sure this never happens to anyone else." They moved to the porch where Catherine had set out cups of coffee and water. Morrison, Pete, and Thomas kept a respectful distance, understanding that some conversations required privacy even in the open air. Mara sat in the chair where Ethan had sat just hours before, facing down Silas Crow's threats, and began to speak. Her voice was small at first, halting and uncertain. She started with her mother's death 6 years ago, the way her father had changed afterward, growing bitter and desperate, always chasing the next opportunity that would restore their fortunes. She described the mounting debts, the way creditors had begun appearing at their door, her father's increasingly wild schemes to raise money. Then came Silas Crow's visit, Vernon Crow beside him with his cold eyes and cruel mouth, and the paper spread across their kitchen table like a sentence being handed down. "My father didn't even ask me," Mara said, her hands wrapped tightly around her water cup. "He just signed his name and told me to pack my things. When I said I didn't want to marry anyone, especially not a man I'd never met who was older than my oldest brother, he said I was being childish and ungrateful. That Vernon was doing us a favor by taking me on." "Taking you on," Garrett repeated, writing carefully. "Like property?" "Like property. Mara confirmed. My brother Jacob said I should be happy. Said plenty of girls my age get married, and at least Vernon had a ranch and money. But I kept thinking about how he looked at me. Not like a person, but like something he'd bought and could do whatever he wanted with. She shuddered. The day Vernon came to collect me, he grabbed my arm so hard. And when I pulled away, he smiled, like my fear was funny to him. That's when I knew I had to run. She described her desperate flight through the night, following the stars and keeping off the main roads, terrified every moment that Vernon or his uncle's men would overtake her. She told about finding Ethan's barn, about hiding in the hay while her body shook with exhaustion and fear, about the relief and disbelief when this stranger had promised to help her instead of sending her back. Garrett wrote it all down in his careful script, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting Mara's story flow. When she finished, her voice hoarse from talking, he closed his notebook and looked at her with something like respect in his weathered features. You did everything right, he said. Running when you had the chance, finding help, telling the truth, even when it's hard. You probably saved other girls from the same fate. We found evidence that Crow's been doing this for years, and your courage in speaking up will help stop him. What happens now? Mara asked. Where do I go? It was the question Ethan had been dreading. The immediate danger had passed, but Mara's situation remained complicated. She couldn't return to her father, who'd already proven he saw her as a commodity to be traded. She had no other family that she'd mentioned, no safe place waiting. At 13, she was too young to simply strike out on her own, even in the territories where people often had to grow up faster than was fair or right. Catherine Walsh cleared her throat delicately. I've been giving that some thought, actually. I have room at the boarding house, and I could use help with the cooking and cleaning. It's honest work, and in exchange, you'd have a bed, meals, and a safe place to stay while we sort out the legal situation. She paused. I also know Miss Sarah Brennan, who runs the school in town. With some tutoring to catch up what you've missed, you could continue your education. Mara's eyes widened. School? Really? Really? You're 13 years old. You should be learning, not serving as payment for someone else's debts. Catherine's voice carried absolute conviction. And when you're older, truly older, not forced into adulthood before you're ready, you can decide what you want to do with your life, on your own terms. I don't have any money to pay you, Mara said uncertainly. I can work, but we'll figure out the details as we go. The important thing is you'll be somewhere safe, somewhere you can grow up properly. Catherine looked at Ethan. Unless Mr. Cole objects to the arrangement? All eyes turned to Ethan. He felt a strange tightness in his chest, relief that Mara would be cared for, but also something that felt uncomfortably like loss. In just 2 days, this frightened child had somehow cracked open the walls he'd built around his grief, letting in light and connection and the possibility that maybe isolation wasn't the only way to survive sorrow. I think it's a good plan, he said carefully. If Mara agrees. But what about you? Mara asked. You're the one who saved me. Stood up to Mr. Crow when no one else would. Doesn't that mean... shouldn't I stay here? Help you with the ranch? Ethan crouched in front of her chair, bringing himself to eye level. Mara, you don't owe me anything. Not loyalty, not labor, nothing. What I did because it was right, not because I expected something in return. He squeezed her hand gently. And staying here, this is a working ranch, isolated, with just me for company most of the time. You'd be lonely and you'd miss out on school, on friends your own age, on everything a normal childhood should include. Catherine's offering you a real chance. Take it. But I'll still see you? The vulnerability in her voice made something crack in Ethan's carefully maintained composure. You'll visit? I'll visit, he promised. And you can come out here too if you want. Help with the horses. Learn ranching if that interests you, but you'll have a real home, Mara, not just a hiding place. Tears spilled down her cheeks again, but this time they carried relief instead of fear. Okay, yes. Thank you. All of you. Marshal Garrett stood, tucking away his notebook. Then that's settled. Miss Walsh, I'll need to file reports with the territorial court about Miss Hutchins' placement. I'll note that she's in your care pending resolution of the legal matters. And my father? Mara asked quietly. What happens to him? Garrett's expression hardened. Your father entered into an illegal arrangement that constituted trafficking of a minor. He'll face charges as well, though likely lesser ones than Crow. The judge will decide his sentence. He paused, measuring his words. I know he's your father, and that complicates things. But what he did was wrong, Mara. Deeply wrong. He put his financial problems ahead of your safety and well-being. I know, she whispered. I've known that for a while now. It still hurts, though. It will for a long time, Catherine said gently. But hurt is better than being trapped. Better than losing yourself to someone else's choices. She stood brushing dust from her skirts. Come on, dear. Let's get you to town, get you properly cleaned up and fed, and show you your new room. Marshall, Mr. Cole, gentlemen, thank you for your help this morning. I suspect we'll all be seeing each other at the courthouse soon enough. As Catherine guided Mara toward the wagon she'd driven out from town, Mara turned back one more time. Ethan? Yeah? Thank you for believing me, for standing up when everyone else was too scared, for... Her voice caught. For making me think maybe there are still good people in the world. Ethan felt his throat tighten. There are good people, Mara. You just have to look for them. And sometimes they show up when you need them most. He gestured toward Morrison, Pete, and Thomas, who were preparing to ride back to their own ranches. Like these men who came to help, like Catherine, who fought with law books and telegrams, like Marshall Garrett, who rode all night. Mara nodded, seeming to absorb this. Then she climbed into Catherine's wagon, and they rolled away down the eastern road, dust rising in their wake. Morrison came to stand beside Ethan as they watched the wagon disappear. You did good, Cole. Real good. We all did, Ethan said. If you hadn't come, if Catherine hadn't gotten word to Garrett, But we did come, that's the point. Morrison clapped him on the shoulder. You made a stand, and we stood with you. That's how this works when people care about doing right instead of doing easy. Pete and Thomas added their goodbyes, each man carrying the satisfied exhaustion that came after facing down danger and emerging intact. As they rode off toward their own properties, Ethan felt the weight of the past 2 days finally beginning to lift. Silas Crow's threats had come to nothing. Mara was safe and heading toward a real future. The immediate crisis had passed. Marshall Garrett remained behind, methodically checking his horse's tack. When the others had gone, he looked at Ethan with thoughtful assessment. You realize Crow won't forget this, Garrett said. Men like him don't handle humiliation well. He's got lawyers, money, connections. He'll fight the charges, and even if he loses, he'll carry a grudge. I figured as much. Just wanted you to be prepared. He can't do much while the federal charges are pending. Any retaliation would look very bad for him in court. But after? He might try to make trouble. Business trouble, mostly. He wasn't bluffing about controlling freight contracts and having relationships with banks. Ethan leaned against the porch railing, feeling the sun-warmed wood beneath his palms. I spent 3 years hiding from life because I was scared of getting hurt again. Scared of losing someone else I cared about. Scared of feeling anything at all. He met Garrett's eyes. I'm done hiding. Whatever Crow does, I'll deal with it. Fair enough. Garrett swung into his saddle with practiced ease. One more thing. You should know that your statement, along with Mara's, helped us connect Crow to at least 3 other similar cases. All families in debt to him, all with daughters who mysteriously ended up married to his business associates or relatives. We're locating those girls now, making sure they're safe. So what you did here, it's going to ripple outward, save more than just one child. The weight of that settled over Ethan, the realization that standing up hadn't just changed Mara's life, but potentially dozens of others. It was overwhelming and humbling and somehow made every moment of fear and uncertainty worth it. Thank you for coming when Catherine called, Ethan said, for caring enough to ride all night. I told you, I lost my daughter to this kind of thing. Never again, if I can help it. Garrett gathered his reins. You're a good man, Cole. Territory needs more people willing to stand up when it matters. Don't go back to hiding on this ranch. World needs you engaged. Then he was riding away, and Ethan was alone with his thoughts and his ranch and the profound silence that settled in the aftermath of crisis. He spent the rest of the day working, letting familiar rhythms soothe nerves still jangled from the morning's confrontation. He fed the cattle, mended the section of fence that had been bothering him for weeks, cleaned the barn, Physical labor that required his hands but left his mind free to wander, processing everything that had happened. Sarah would have liked Mara, he thought, would have taken her in without a second thought, would have fought just as hard to protect her. Sarah had always believed that when you had the power to help someone, you had the obligation to do so. She'd lived that principle every day of their marriage, taking in injured animals, helping struggling neighbors, standing up for what was right, even when it was inconvenient. After she died, Ethan had abandoned those principles, too raw with grief to face the possibility of more loss. But Mara's desperate flight to his barn had reminded him that isolation wasn't safety. It was just a different kind of death, slower and lonelier. As evening approached, he found himself standing in the small bedroom where Mara had slept, looking at the rumpled quilt and the water cup still on the nightstand. The room felt empty in a way it hadn't before, like something important had passed through and left an absence in its wake. But it wasn't the hollow, aching absence that had filled his house since Sarah died. This was different. The knowledge that someone had needed shelter and found it, had faced terror and survived it, had been lost and was now moving toward being found again. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Jack Morrison standing on the porch, holding a covered dish. "Margaret insisted I bring this by," Morrison said, referring to his wife. "Said you probably haven't eaten properly in days and someone needs to make sure you don't starve after doing something heroic." Ethan took the dish, beef stew by the smell, rich and savory. "Thank your wife for me. And tell her it wasn't heroic, just necessary." "She said you'd say that." Morrison lingered, clearly wanting to say something else. "Can I come in for a minute?" They settled at Ethan's kitchen table with coffee, the evening light slanting through the windows and turning everything golden. Morrison stirred his cup thoughtfully before speaking. "Margaret and I have been talking. About you, about what happened with Mara, about these past few years you've been alone out here." He looked up. "You've been grieving, and that's right and proper. But grief isn't meant to be permanent. It's meant to honor what was lost and then gradually make space for what comes next." "I'm not sure I'm ready for what comes next," Ethan said quietly. "Maybe not. But ready or not, life keeps happening. That girl showed up on your doorstep, and you chose to engage with the world again, to care about someone else's fate. That's growth, Ethan. That's healing, whether you recognize it or not." Ethan traced the rim of his cup with one finger. "I keep thinking about what Catherine said, that Mara needs to go to school, make friends, have a normal childhood, and she does. But part of me wanted her to stay here. Not because I need ranch help, but because, he struggled for the words. Because having someone to protect, someone to care about, made me feel alive again in a way I haven't felt since Sarah died. That's natural, but you're right to let her go to Catherine's. What that child needs is stability and education and a chance to figure out who she is beyond what was done to her." Morrison paused. "But that doesn't mean you have to go back to living like a hermit. There's a whole community out here, Ethan. People who respect you, who'd welcome your company. You just have to be willing to reach out." "I'll think about it," Ethan promised. "Do more than think. Come to dinner next week. Margaret's been asking. And there's a dance in town next month, Harvest Celebration. You should come. Not to find a new wife or anything," Morrison added quickly, seeing Ethan's expression. "Just to be around people. Remember what it's like to be part of something bigger than your own land and your own grief." After Morrison left, Ethan sat alone in the gathering darkness and thought about community, about connection, about the difference between solitude chosen as healing and isolation imposed as punishment. He thought about Mara's courage in running toward an uncertain future, rather than accepting a fate she knew was wrong. He thought about Catherine Walsh and her legal maneuvering, about Marshall Garrett riding through the night, about his neighbors standing with him against power and money and threats. He thought about Sarah, about the life they'd planned and lost, and about the way love didn't really end when someone died. It just changed form, becoming memory and motivation, and the drive to honor what mattered to the person you'd lost. Sarah would want him to live, not just survive. She would want him to care about people, to stand up for what was right, to build something meaningful with whatever years he had left. She wouldn't want him frozen in the moment of her death, unable to move forward because moving forward felt like leaving her behind. The next morning, Ethan rode into town. He told himself it was to check on Mara, to make sure she'd settled in at Catherine's boarding house. But as his horse carried him down the familiar road, he acknowledged that it was more than that. It was choosing engagement over isolation, connection over safety, life over mere existence. The town was busier than he remembered, people moving between shops and businesses with the purposeful energy of frontier life. He received more than a few curious looks. Word of yesterday's confrontation had clearly spread, and people were reassessing the quiet widower rancher who'd stood up to Silas Crow. He found Catherine's boarding house on the main street, a two-story building with fresh white paint and flower boxes in the windows. Catherine herself answered his knock, her stern features softening when she saw who it was. "Mr. Cole, come in, come in. Mara's been asking about you all morning." She led him through a clean, well-lit hallway to a sitting room where Mara sat at a table with books spread around her. She looked different already, cleaner, better rested, wearing a simple dress that actually fit her instead of the torn, dirty clothes she'd arrived in. But more than that, something had shifted in her posture. She sat straighter, met his eyes directly, carried herself with the beginnings of confidence instead of hunched fear. "Ethan!" She jumped up, then seemed to catch herself, suddenly uncertain. "I mean, Mr. Cole, Mrs. Walsh said I should be more formal." "Ethan's fine," he assured her, and she smiled with visible relief. They talked for an hour, Mara telling him about her room, about the books Catherine had given her, about the school she'd be starting next week. Catherine joined them with tea and cookies, and they sat together in the autumn sunlight streaming through the windows, discussing ordinary things, weather, horses, the upcoming harvest season. Normal conversation, comfortable and easy, worlds away from the terror and drama of just days before. As Ethan prepared to leave, Mara walked him to the door. "I'm glad you came," she said quietly. "I was worried you'd just go back to your ranch and I'd never see you again. I promised I'd visit. I keep my promises." "I know. That's what makes you different." She looked up at him with those two old eyes that had seen too much. "Most adults in my life have broken promises. My mother promised she'd always be there, but she died. My father promised to take care of me, but he sold me. Vernon promised I'd be happy, but I knew he was lying." She paused. "But you promised to protect me, and you did. Even when it was dangerous. Even when you didn't have to." "I'll always keep my word to you, Mara. You can count on that." She hugged him suddenly, fiercely, and Ethan felt something in his chest crack open, not breaking, but expanding, making room for new possibilities, new connections, new reasons to engage with the world beyond his ranch boundaries. When he rode back home that afternoon, the landscape looked different somehow. The same mountains in the distance, the same rolling grassland, the same autumn blue sky overhead. But Ethan saw it all through different eyes, not as a place to hide, but as a place to live, to build something meaningful. To honor Sarah's memory not by freezing in grief, but by living according to the principles she'd believed in. Standing up for Mara had cost him his isolation and comfortable numbness, but in exchange, it had given him back something he'd thought he'd lost forever. The sense that his choices mattered, that he could make a difference, that there were things in this world worth fighting for beyond just surviving one more day. As the sun set over his ranch that evening, Ethan Cole allowed himself to imagine a future that included more than just cattle and silence and carefully maintained distance from human connection. He imagined checking in on Mara as she grew up, helping her learn ranching if that's what she chose. He imagined accepting Morrison's dinner invitation, maybe even going to that harvest dance. He imagined slowly, carefully rebuilding a life that honored what he'd lost while remaining open to what might still come. It wasn't the life he'd planned with Sarah, but it was a life worth living, and that was more than he'd had just 3 days ago when a terrified child had hidden in his barn and asked for help. Sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was simply say yes when life offered them a chance to care about something again. The weeks that followed carried a strange quality, like the world had shifted on its axis and everything familiar now sat at a slightly different angle. Ethan fell into a new rhythm that included regular trips to town, something he hadn't done with any consistency since Sarah's death. Every few days he'd saddle his horse and make the ride to check on Mara, bringing small gifts, a book he thought she might like, wildflowers from the high meadow, once a perfectly shaped piece of quartz he'd found near the creek that caught sunlight and threw rainbows across whatever surface it touched. Mara had started school and took to learning with the hunger of someone who'd been denied it too long. Miss Brennan, the schoolteacher, reported to Catherine that Mara was bright and determined, working through lessons meant for younger students with patience and grace, catching up on years of missed education. In the evenings, Mara helped Catherine at the boarding house, learning to cook and clean and manage the kind of domestic work that would serve her well, regardless of what path her life eventually took. But the legal situation remained complicated and slow-moving, as such things always were in the territories where justice had to travel long distances and navigate through layers of local politics and federal oversight. Silas Crowe had indeed hired lawyers, expensive ones from back east who specialized in contract law and weren't above using procedural delays to stretch proceedings out for months. The federal charges Marshal Garrett had promised moved forward at a glacial pace, tangled in jurisdictional questions and motions and countermotions that seemed designed to exhaust everyone involved. Ethan learned all this during his third visit to Catherine's boarding house, sitting in her private parlor while Mara was at school. Catherine poured him coffee and laid out the situation with the blunt clarity that characterized everything she did. The good news is that Judge Hartwell in Billings has issued a temporary injunction preventing any enforcement of the marriage contract while the case proceeds. Mara is legally under my guardianship for now, and her father has been barred from any contact. Catherine's expression hardened. Benjamin Hutchins tried to come to town last week, demanding to see her. I had Deputy Barnes escort him to the county line and inform him that if he returned, he'd be arrested for violating the judge's order. How did he take that? About as well as you'd expect. Lots of bluster about his rights as her father, threats about what would happen when this all got sorted out. The usual nonsense from a man who's been told no for perhaps the first time in his life. She took a sip of coffee. The interesting part is that Vernon Crowe has made no attempt to contact Mara or assert any claim. Marshal Garrett believes Vernon's keeping his distance on his lawyer's advice. Anything he does now could be used against him in court. And Silas Crowe? Catherine's smile was thin and satisfied. There's where things get interesting. The federal investigation into his business practices has expanded significantly. Turns out when you start looking closely at a man like Crowe, all sorts of irregularities come to light. Freight contracts awarded under suspicious circumstances, books that don't quite balance, workers who were essentially indentured through debt schemes very similar to what he tried with Mara. The U.S. Marshal's office has frozen several of his accounts pending the investigation. So he's weakened. Considerably. But not defeated. And that's what concerns me. Catherine set down her cup, her sharp eyes studying Ethan carefully. Crowe is still a powerful man with connections throughout the territory. He's fighting these charges with everything he has because if he loses not just money, but reputation and influence. A man like that, cornered and desperate, can be very dangerous. You think he'll try something? I think he's the type to see everything as a transaction, everyone as either an asset or an obstacle. Right now, you, me, Marshal Garrett, and especially Mara, we're all obstacles to him getting what he wants, which is to make this go away, restore his reputation, and return to business as usual. She paused. Have you noticed anyone watching your ranch? Strangers in town asking questions about you? Ethan thought about it. Now that she mentioned it, there had been a man he didn't recognize at the general store last week, someone who'd seemed very interested in Ethan's conversation with the shopkeeper about feed prices. And Morrison had mentioned seeing unfamiliar riders on the road between their properties, men who didn't wave or acknowledge him in the way frontier neighbors typically did. Maybe, he admitted, nothing overt, but some things that felt off. Trust that feeling. Crowe can't make a direct move against Mara while she's under legal protection and in my care. Too many witnesses, too much scrutiny. But you? You're more isolated, easier to get to. If something happened to you, if you were suddenly unable or unwilling to testify. She let the implication hang. You think he'd actually try to hurt me? Or worse? I think desperate men do desperate things. And I think you should be careful, especially when you're alone on that ranch. Catherine reached across the table and gripped his hand, her touch surprisingly warm. I'm not trying to scare you, Ethan, just urging caution. You stood up for a child when no one else would, and that makes you a target for a man who's used to people backing down. The conversation stayed with Ethan as he rode home that afternoon. his eyes scanning the landscape with new wariness. Every shadow seemed potentially threatening, every distant rider a possible danger. It was exhausting, this constant vigilance, and he understood in a new way how Mara must have felt during her desperate flight from Vernon Crow. That terrible awareness that safety was an illusion and danger could materialize at any moment. But when he reached his ranch and saw it whole and undisturbed, cattle grazing peacefully, and the house exactly as he'd left it, some of the tension eased. Maybe Catherine was being overly cautious. Maybe Crow was too focused on his legal battles to worry about revenge against a small-time rancher. Maybe the danger existed more in imagination than reality. That optimism lasted exactly 3 days. Ethan was mending fence in the south pasture when he smelled smoke. Not the clean wood smoke of a cooking fire, but something heavier, more chemical. He dropped his tools and ran toward the ranch buildings, his heart hammering. As he cleared the rise, he saw it, black smoke billowing from his barn, flames already licking up the eastern wall where the wood was oldest and driest. He ran faster than he'd thought possible, his mind cataloging everything in that barn. Tools, tack, feed stores, but more importantly the hidden cellar where he'd protected Mara. If the fire reached the tack room, if the floor gave way, all evidence of that hiding place would be destroyed. And while Mara was safe in town, the cellar contained other things, Sarah's preserves, some of their personal belongings he'd stored there, pieces of a life that already felt like it was slipping away. The heat hit him like a physical blow as he reached the barn. The fire had already consumed the back section and was spreading fast, feeding on dry wood and old hay. Ethan grabbed the water bucket by the door and threw it uselessly at the flames, knowing even as he did it that it was futile. The barn was going to burn, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He managed to get the horses out, leading them away from the smoke and flames to the corral on the far side of the property. He grabbed what tools he could reach from the front section before the heat drove him back. But the tack room, the cellar, everything in the barn's interior, all of it was lost to the inferno. Jack Morrison arrived first, drawn by the smoke visible from his property. Then Pete Whitmore and Thomas Chen, and soon a dozen neighbors Ethan barely knew, all forming a bucket brigade from the well to keep the fire from spreading to the house. They worked in grim silence, faces streaked with soot and sweat, fighting not to save the barn but to prevent the flames from taking everything else. By the time they finally had the fire contained, the barn was a smoking ruin. Charred beams jutted up like broken bones, and everything inside was ash and twisted metal. Ethan stood staring at the destruction, his hands blistered from handling hot tools, his lungs raw from smoke inhalation, and felt rage build in his chest alongside the grief. Morrison came to stand beside him, a canvas of soot himself. "This wasn't an accident." "No," Ethan agreed, his voice rough. "It wasn't. Found this near the back wall, downwind where the fire started." Morrison held up a half-melted glass bottle, the kind used for lamp oil. "Someone set this deliberately." The neighbors gathered around, their expressions darkening as they understood the implications. This wasn't bad luck or a carelessly dropped cigarette. This was arson, destruction intended to send a message or inflict harm or both. "Crow," Pete said flatly. "Has to be." "Can't prove it," Thomas pointed out. "He's too smart to do this himself, and whoever he hired won't talk." "Doesn't matter if we can prove it," Morrison said. "We all know the truth. Question is, what do we do about it?" Ethan looked around at these men who'd come running when they saw smoke, who'd worked for hours to save what they could, who stood with him now even knowing that association with him might make them targets too. He thought about Mara safe in Catherine's boarding house, about Sarah's memory and what she'd want him to do, about the line between justice and revenge, and whether that line even mattered anymore. "We report it to Marshal Garrett," he said finally. "Let him investigate. Add it to the charges against Crow if there's evidence to connect it. But we do this through the law, not by taking matters into our own hands." Even though the law is taking forever and Crow's still free to hurt people? Pete's frustration was evident, especially because of that. If we act outside the law, we become no better than him. We prove that might makes right, and the only thing that matters is who's willing to go furthest. Ethan's voice was steady, despite the rage still burning in his chest. "I won't give him that. I won't let him turn me into someone who solves problems with fire and violence." Morrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're a better man than I might be in your position. But you're right. We do this properly, through channels, even if it takes longer." He gestured at the ruined barn. "You'll need help rebuilding. We'll organize a barn raising, get your neighbors together, 2 weeks from Saturday, weather permitting." "I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. We're offering. That's what neighbors do." Morrison's tone left no room for argument. "Crow wants to isolate you, make you feel like standing up to him was a mistake that'll cost you everything. We're not going to let that happen." Over the next hour, the neighbors organized themselves with the kind of efficient cooperation that characterized frontier life. Someone would bring timber. Someone else had extra roofing materials. Thomas knew a man who could get windows at cost. They'd gather in 2 weeks with tools and materials and strong backs, and they'd rebuild what Crow's hired thugs had destroyed. After they left, Ethan walked through the smoking ruins, cataloging what was lost. The tackroom floor had burned through completely, exposing the cellar below. The preserves were shattered, glass and food mixed with ash. Sarah's quilts stored in the trunk were nothing but charred fragments. The tools and equipment represented hundreds of dollars he didn't really have to replace. But as devastating as it was, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it could have been worse. The fire had been set during the day when he was nearby and able to respond. The horses had been in the corral, not trapped inside. If someone had really wanted to cause maximum damage, they could have waited for night, blocked the doors, ensured everything was lost. This felt more like a warning than an attempt at destruction. A reminder that Silas Crow could reach him here, hurt him, take away the things he valued. A message that said standing up had consequences, and those consequences could escalate if Ethan didn't back down. As the sun set over the ruined barn, Ethan made himself a promise. He wouldn't back down. He wouldn't let fear dictate his choices or intimidation change his testimony. If Crow wanted him frightened into silence, he'd badly misjudged his target. The next morning, Ethan rode into town to report the fire to Marshal Garrett. He found the lawman at Catherine's boarding house, actually, meeting with her about some aspect of the ongoing investigation. When Ethan described the fire and showed him the melted bottle Morrison had found, Garrett's expression went granite hard. "He's escalating," Garrett said. "This is exactly the kind of thing I was afraid of. Crow's seen his empire crumble and he's lashing out at the people he blames. Can you prove he's behind it? Not directly, but I can add it to the pattern of intimidation and retaliation I'm building. And I can make sure he knows we're watching closely for his next move." Garrett pulled out his notebook. "Tell me everything. When you discovered the fire, who helped, what you found afterward. Every detail matters." While Ethan recounted the previous day's events, Mara appeared in the doorway, home from school. Her face went pale when she heard about the fire. "This is my fault," she said, her voice small and devastated. "Mr. Crow is doing this because you helped me. He's hurting you to get back at me." "No." Ethan stood and went to her, gripping her shoulders gently but firmly. "Listen to me, Mara. This is not your fault. You didn't set that fire. You didn't choose to be sold to Vernon Crow. You didn't create any of this situation. Crow did. Your father did. But not you. Never you. But if I'd just gone with Vernon, if I hadn't run, then you'd be trapped in a marriage you never agreed to, with a man who sees you as property. And Crow would still be selling children to settle debts, still ruining lives, still acting like money and power mean he can do whatever he wants." Ethan's voice was fierce. "You running, you fighting back, that's what finally started to bring him down. Don't you dare apologize for that." Tears streaked down Mara's face, but she nodded. Catherine moved to put an arm around her, maternal and protective, and Ethan felt a surge of gratitude for this woman who'd taken in a desperate child and given her not just shelter, but genuine care. "He's right, dear," Catherine said softly. "You're not responsible for the choices of grown men who should know better. You're just a child trying to survive in a world that hasn't been fair to you." Marshal Garrett closed his notebook and stood. "Mr. Cole, I'm going to assign a deputy to ride by your ranch daily, just to check on things. And I'm going to have a very direct conversation with Silas Crow about the consequences of witness intimidation. He's already facing federal charges. If I can connect him to this arson, it'll add years to any sentence he receives." Will that stop him? Honestly, I don't know. Men like Crow sometimes get more reckless as the walls close in. But I can make it clear that any further incidents will be investigated thoroughly and prosecuted aggressively. Garrett's expression softened slightly. You did the right thing, standing up when you did. Don't let this make you doubt that. After Garrett left to begin his investigation, Ethan sat with Catherine and Mara in the boarding house kitchen, drinking coffee and trying to process everything. The smell of Catherine's baking filled the air, comfortable and domestic, at odds with the conversation about arson and intimidation and legal battles. The barn raising is in 2 weeks, Ethan said, directing this at Mara. Morrison and the others are organizing it. If you want to come out, help with the work, you'd be welcome. Mara's eyes lit up, the first genuine brightness he'd seen since she'd learned about the fire. Really? I could help? If Catherine approves, there'll be a lot of people, hard work, but also food and community. It might be good for you to see that what Crow destroyed can be rebuilt. That damage isn't permanent. Catherine nodded permission. I think that's an excellent idea, and I'll come too. Bring food. A barn raising is a community event, and Mara should see the kind of support that exists when people choose to stand together. The 2 weeks until the barn raising passed in a blur of preparation. Ethan cleared the burned debris, salvaging what he could and disposing of the rest. Neighbors stopped by with materials, boards and nails, tools to replace what he'd lost, offers of labor and expertise. Morrison kept his promise about organizing, visiting every ranch within 15 miles to recruit help and coordinate the effort. During this time, word spread about the fire and its suspected cause. Public opinion in the territory began to shift noticeably against Silas Crow. People who'd been neutral or afraid to take sides started speaking up. The newspaper in Billings ran an editorial questioning why federal charges were taking so long and suggesting that Crow's influence was delaying justice. Even some of Crow's business associates began quietly distancing themselves, not wanting to be associated with arson and witness intimidation. Ethan also noticed increased attention from law enforcement. Deputies rode by his ranch daily as Garrett had promised, but more than that, he saw signs of active investigation. Men from the marshal's office interviewing neighbors, asking questions, building cases. The legal machinery was grinding forward, slow but inexorable. 3 days before the barn raising, Ethan received an unexpected visitor. He was working on the foundation for the new barn when a horse and rider appeared on the eastern road, not from town, but from the direction of the Hutchins homestead. As the rider drew closer, Ethan recognized Benjamin Hutchins, Mara's father. Ethan's hand moved instinctively to the rifle leaning against the fence post. Hutchins saw the gesture and raised both hands, showing them empty. I'm not here to cause trouble, Hutchins called out. I just want to talk, please. Against his better judgment, Ethan waited as Hutchins dismounted and approached on foot. The man looked like he'd aged a decade in the weeks since Mara had run. His face was gaunt, his clothes shabby, his eyes carrying a haunted quality that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy guilt. You're not supposed to be anywhere near here, Ethan said coldly. Judge's orders. I know, but I had to see you, had to try to... Hutchins stopped, seeming to struggle for words. I need you to understand. When I signed those papers, when I agreed to Crow's arrangement, I thought I was saving my family. The debt was crushing us, and Crow said Mara would be cared for, that Vernon had a good ranch, that she'd want for nothing. She's 13 years old. I know. Hutchins' voice cracked. I know that now. But at the time, I only saw the debt, the threat of losing everything. I told myself plenty of girls marry young in the territories, that it was providing for her future. I told myself a lot of things to justify what I knew in my gut was wrong. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know that what you did, standing up, protecting her, it saved her from a terrible fate. And it made me finally see what I'd become, what I'd been willing to do. Hutchins wiped his eyes roughly. I've lost everything anyway. The homestead's gone to pay other debts. My sons won't speak to me, and my daughter is better off without me. I know that. Ethan studied this broken man, feeling not satisfaction, but a kind of weary sadness. Mara asks about you sometimes, wonders if you're okay, if you regret what happened. She still loves you, even after everything. That's the kind of person she is, better than either of us deserve. I know I can't make this right. Can't undo signing those papers or make up for choosing debt over my own child. Hutchins met Ethan's eyes with difficulty. But I wanted you to know that I'm testifying. At the trial, whenever it finally happens, I'm going to tell the court exactly what Crow did, how he manipulated me, how the whole arrangement was wrong from the start. It won't change what I did, but maybe it'll help put him away. That's the first decent thing you've said since you got here. It's the first decent thing I've done in a long time. Hutchins turned to go, then paused. Take care of her. Let her grow up right. Make her own choices. Become whoever she's meant to be. That's all I'm asking. That was always the plan. Ethan watched Hutchins ride away, feeling something shift in his understanding of the situation. Crow was the architect of this whole terrible scheme, the man who'd seen opportunity in another's desperation and exploited it without mercy. But Hutchins wasn't entirely a victim either. He'd made choices, prioritized the wrong things, failed his daughter when she needed him most. The world was full of people like that, Ethan was learning. Not purely good or evil, just weak or desperate or so focused on their own problems that they couldn't see the harm they were causing. The morning of the barn raising dawned clear and cool, perfect autumn weather. Ethan was up before sunrise, preparing coffee and laying out the foundation work that needed to be done first. By 7, the first wagons began arriving. Morrison and his family, Pete with his sons, Thomas, and several other Chinese homesteaders from the river settlement. Then more and more, until Ethan's property was filled with people, tools, lumber, and the organized chaos of a community coming together. Catherine arrived mid-morning with Mara and 3 other women from town, their wagon loaded with food. They set up tables under the trees and began laying out a feast. Roasted chickens, fresh bread, pies and cakes, crocks of beans and potatoes. The women worked with practiced efficiency while the men framed the barn, raising walls and setting beams with coordinated effort. Mara moved through the crowd with wonder on her face, helping where she could, but mostly just absorbing the energy of dozens of people working together for a common purpose. Ethan caught glimpses of her throughout the day, holding nails for one of Morrison's sons, bringing water to workers, listening to stories from some of the older women about other barn raisings, other communities they'd built across the frontier. By afternoon, the basic structure was up. By evening, they had walls and most of the roof. As the sun set, people began packing up tools and saying their goodbyes, promising to return the following Saturday to finish the detail work. Ethan tried to thank each person individually, but the words felt inadequate to express his gratitude. Morrison clasped his shoulder as he prepared to leave. This is what community looks like, Ethan. People standing together when it matters. Remember that next time you think about hiding on this ranch for another 3 years? After everyone had gone, Ethan and Mara stood together looking at the new barn taking shape where the burned one had been. It wasn't finished yet, but the bones were strong and straight, built by hands that cared about doing the job right. It's beautiful, Mara said quietly. Not because of what it is, but because of what it means. What does it mean? Ethan asked, curious about her perspective. That some things can be destroyed, but they can also be rebuilt. That people care enough to help even when it's hard. That Mr. Crow can burn down a barn, but he can't burn down community or courage or people choosing to stand together. She looked up at him. That maybe things can get better even when they seem hopeless. Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion. This child who'd been through so much, who'd faced betrayal and fear and violation of trust, could still see hope and meaning in a partially built barn and a gathering of neighbors. That was resilience, true and profound. You're going to be okay, he said, believing it fully for the first time. Whatever happens with the trial, with Crow, with your future, you're going to be okay. Because you've got what it takes to survive hard things and come out stronger. We're going to be okay, Mara corrected. All of us. Because we're not alone anymore. As darkness fell and Catherine's wagon carried Mara back to town, Ethan stood in the yard of his ranch and felt the truth of her words settle into his bones. The isolation he'd wrapped around himself after Sarah's death had finally, completely broken apart. In its place was something better: connection, community, purpose beyond just surviving each day. The cost had been high, and there were still battles to fight, but for the first time in 3 years, Ethan Cole felt truly alive. Winter came early to Montana that year, the first snow falling in mid-October and transforming the landscape into something stark and beautiful. The new barn stood complete now, its fresh timber still pale against the weathered gray of the house, a testament to what could be rebuilt when people chose to stand together. Ethan kept it stocked with hay and tools. The horses settled comfortably in their stalls, and every time he walked through those doors, he thought about the dozens of hands that had raised those walls and the message Silas Crow had tried to send with fire. The legal proceedings had finally gained momentum. Marshal Garrett's investigation had uncovered 3 other families whose daughters had been married off to settle debts with Crow's business empire, each case following the same pattern: desperate fathers, binding contracts, young girls who'd never been asked for consent. 2 of those girls had been located, and their testimonies added weight to the federal charges. The U.S. Marshal's Office had also found irregularities in Crow's freight business that suggested years of fraud, intimidation, and exploitation of workers through debt bondage schemes that skirted the edges of legality and sometimes crossed well over. The trial was set for late November in Billings, with Judge Hartwell presiding. Ethan received his summons to testify in early November, the official document making everything feel suddenly real and immediate. He'd be called as a witness along with Mara, Catherine Walsh, Deputy Barnes, and Benjamin Hutchins, whose promise to testify against Crow had apparently held despite whatever pressure had surely been applied to make him recant. Mara had grown in the months since she'd fled to Ethan's barn, not just physically, though she'd gained healthy weight and lost that hollow-cheeked desperation, but in confidence and presence. School had given her structure and friendship with girls her own age. Catherine's boarding house had provided stability and maternal care that Mara had been missing since her own mother's death. She still had nightmares sometimes, Catherine reported, still carried fear that Vernon or her father would somehow appear and drag her back. But those episodes were growing less frequent, the terror gradually giving way to cautious hope about the future. Ethan visited town twice a week now, a routine that had become comfortable rather than obligatory. He'd have coffee with Catherine and Mara, help Mara with her mathematics homework, which she struggled with, listen to her read aloud from whatever book she was currently devouring. Sometimes they'd walk through town together, and Ethan would watch how people greeted Mara with kindness, how the shopkeepers asked about her schooling, how the other children included her in their games. She was building a life, becoming part of the community rather than just a frightened refugee hiding from a terrible fate. He'd also begun accepting the social invitations he'd refused for 3 years. Dinner at the Morrisons, where he had discovered that conversation and laughter could exist without betraying Sarah's memory. The harvest dance, where he'd felt awkward and out of place, but had stayed anyway, watching couples twirl across the floor and children race between the dancers. A quilting bee that Catherine had somehow convinced him to attend, where he'd sat among the women and learned that grief was something they all carried in different ways, and that sharing it made the weight more bearable. The isolation that had felt like protection now seemed like a kind of death, and Ethan found himself grateful to the desperate child who'd stumbled into his barn and cracked open the walls he'd built around his wounded heart. 3 days before they were scheduled to leave for Billings and the trial, Ethan received an unexpected visit. He was working with one of his horses in the corral when a fine carriage appeared on the road, pulled by matched gray horses and driven by a man in formal livery. The carriage itself was black lacquered wood with brass fittings, the kind of vehicle that announced wealth and status even from a distance. Ethan's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle propped against the fence, but he forced himself to wait and see who emerged. When the carriage door opened, a woman stepped down, elegant in a deep blue traveling dress, with her dark hair pinned beneath a fashionable hat. She was perhaps 40, with sharp, intelligent eyes, and the kind of bearing that suggested she was used to being taken seriously. "Mr. Cole?" she called, approaching the corral with confident strides. "My name is Margaret Hartwell. I'm Judge Hartwell's wife, though I practice law in my own right. May I have a moment of your time?" Ethan opened the gate and gestured her toward the house. "Of course. Can I offer you coffee?" "That would be lovely. Thank you." Inside, Ethan prepared coffee while Margaret Hartwell settled at his table, her observant gaze taking in the modest house with its touches of femininity that hadn't been changed since Sarah's death. When he set the cup before her, she thanked him and got straight to the point. "I'm here unofficially, Mr. Cole, which is why I didn't send advance notice. My husband is presiding over the Crow trial, and while he maintains complete impartiality in his courtroom, I have no such constraints." She took a sip of coffee. "I've been following this case closely, and I wanted to meet the man who stood up to Silas Crow when few others would. I'm not sure I deserve any particular credit. I just did what seemed right. That's precisely what makes it remarkable. Most people know what's right. Very few are willing to act on it when there's a cost involved." Margaret set down her cup. "I've also been working behind the scenes to ensure this trial proceeds fairly and that Crow's influence doesn't corrupt the proceedings. He's hired expensive lawyers from Chicago who are very skilled at manipulating territorial law to their client's advantage. You think he might win? I think the evidence against him is substantial and damning. But I also know that justice isn't always served, particularly when wealth and power are involved." Her expression hardened. "Which is why I'm here to tell you that your testimony matters enormously. You're credible, sympathetic, and you have no financial stake in the outcome. When you tell the court what Mara said to you, what you witnessed, why you chose to help her, that narrative cuts through legal maneuvering and speaks to basic human decency. Mara will have to testify too, won't she?" "Yes. And that will be difficult for her, but also powerful. The jury will see a child speaking truth about what was done to her, and that's hard to dismiss or explain away." Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. "However, Crow's lawyers will try to discredit her. They'll argue she's confused, that she misunderstood the arrangement, that her father had legal authority to make decisions on her behalf. They may even suggest she was influenced by you or Catherine Walsh to tell a particular version of events." Anger flared in Ethan's chest. "She's a child who was sold to settle a debt. That's not confusion or influence, that's what happened." "I know, you know. But Crow's defense will be built on creating reasonable doubt, on making the jury question whether what occurred was really criminal or just an unfortunate misunderstanding within the bounds of parental authority and contract law." Margaret's voice took on steel. "Which is why your testimony must be clear, detailed, and unshakable. You need to describe exactly what Mara said, how she looked, the fear in her eyes. Make the jury see what you saw when she appeared in your barn." "I can do that." "I believe you can. I also wanted to warn you that Crow's lawyers may try to attack your character. They'll dig into your past, look for anything they can use to suggest you had ulterior motives for helping Mara. They may imply impropriety, question why a widowed man would take in a young girl, suggest there's something suspicious about your involvement." The implication made Ethan's stomach turn. "That's disgusting." "It's effective, which is why unscrupulous lawyers use it. I'm not saying they'll succeed. Judge Hartwell will shut down anything too egregious. But you should be prepared for personal attacks." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "Don't let them make you angry. Don't let them provoke you into losing your composure. Just tell the truth plainly and let the facts speak for themselves." After Margaret Hartwell left, Ethan sat alone in his house and thought about what was coming. He'd known intellectually that testifying would be difficult, but having the reality laid out so starkly made it feel more daunting. The idea that lawyers would question his motives, imply terrible things about his relationship with Mara, try to twist his act of protection into something sordid. It made him furious and sick at once. But he also thought about Mara's face when she'd climbed out of that cellar, about her whispered words that she was too young to be a wife, about the way she'd slowly rebuilt herself into a confident young girl with dreams about her future. Whatever attacks came in that courtroom, whatever discomfort or embarrassment he had to endure, it was nothing compared to what she'd survived. The journey to Billings took 2 days, traveling by coach with Catherine and Mara. Marshal Garrett had arranged for them to stay at a hotel near the courthouse under deputy protection, taking no chances that Crow might try something desperate before the trial. The hotel was modest but clean, and Ethan found himself in a small room with a window overlooking the main street where he could watch people going about their ordinary business, unaware of the legal battle about to unfold. Mara was terrified. He could see it in her face despite her attempts to appear brave. The night before her testimony, Ethan found her sitting alone in the hotel dining room, staring at her untouched dinner. "Can't eat?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. She shook her head. I keep thinking about having to see them, Mr. Crow and Vernon and my father all in the same room, having to talk about what happened while they're watching me. You don't have to look at them. You can look at the judge, or at me and Catherine in the gallery, or at the jury if that feels easier. You don't owe them your eyes. What if I freeze? What if I can't speak, or I say the wrong thing, or they make me look stupid? Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. Mara, you survived your mother's death, your father's betrayal, running through the night alone, and everything that came after. You're one of the bravest people I know. Tomorrow you just have to do what you've always done. Tell the truth and trust that it matters. Does it matter? Truth, I mean. When the other side has expensive lawyers and money and power? Sometimes no. Sometimes powerful people get away with terrible things because the system is rigged in their favor. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. But sometimes truth wins anyway. Sometimes a jury sees through the legal maneuvering and recognizes right from wrong. We have to believe this is one of those times, or there's no point in trying. She nodded slowly, then finally picked up her fork and took a small bite of food. They ate together in silence, and Ethan felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. This child was trusting him, trusting the system, trusting that standing up would lead to justice rather than more pain. He desperately hoped that trust wouldn't be misplaced. The courthouse was an imposing building of red brick and white columns, built to project authority and permanence in a territory that often felt temporary and lawless. Inside, the courtroom was all dark wood and high ceilings, with rows of benches for spectators and a raised platform where Judge Hartwell would preside. Ethan took his seat in the gallery next to Catherine, watching as the room filled with lawyers, court officials, journalists who'd come from as far as Denver to cover the trial, and curious citizens drawn by the spectacle of a powerful man facing federal charges. When Silas Crow was led in, Ethan felt a visceral shock at how diminished he appeared. The confident, threatening man who'd ridden onto Ethan's property with armed men had been replaced by someone who looked older, harder, carrying the strain of months of legal battles and public scrutiny. But his eyes were still calculating, still watching everyone in the courtroom as if looking for weakness to exploit. Vernon Crow entered separately, accompanied by his own lawyer. He looked exactly as Mara had described, thick-built with mean eyes and a cruel mouth, someone who viewed the world through a lens of ownership and entitlement. When his gaze swept the gallery and landed on Ethan, recognition flickered, followed by raw hatred. The trial opened with the prosecution laying out their case in methodical detail. The assistant U.S. attorney was a young man named Peters, who'd clearly done his homework, presenting documents that showed the pattern of Crow's debt-for-marriage schemes across multiple families, financial records suggesting fraud and worker exploitation, testimony from people who'd been threatened or intimidated when they'd tried to resist. It was damning and comprehensive, building a portrait of a man who'd used his economic power to control and exploit vulnerable people for years. Crow's defense team, led by a silver-haired lawyer named Thornton, who'd come from Chicago specifically for this case, argued that everything Crow had done was within his legal rights as a businessman. The marriage contracts were arranged with parental consent, as was common in frontier territories. The freight business operated according to standard practices. Any accusations of intimidation or fraud were exaggerations from disgruntled former associates. Thornton presented Crow as a successful entrepreneur, being persecuted by federal overreach and changing social attitudes about parental authority. The first 2 days of testimony featured financial experts, other victims of Crow's schemes, and law enforcement officials describing their investigation. Ethan watched it all, trying to understand the legal strategies at play, feeling increasingly anxious about when he'd be called. On the third day, Mara testified. Ethan watched her walk to the witness stand, small and young, in a simple dress Catherine had made for her, and felt his heart clench. She was sworn in, her voice steady as she promised to tell the truth, and then Peters began his questions. Slowly, carefully, he drew out her story. Her mother's death, her father's debts, the day Silas Crow appeared with papers and Vernon by his side. Mara's voice wavered but didn't break as she described learning she'd been promised in marriage to settle her father's obligations, how she'd pleaded with her father and been told she had no choice, how her brothers had called her selfish for objecting. And when Vernon Crow came to take you to his ranch, what happened? Peters asked gently. He grabbed my arm very hard. Mara's hand moved unconsciously to her bicep, where the bruises had long since faded. And he said we'd have a proper wedding night once we got to his ranch. The way he smiled when he said it. I knew what he meant. I knew what would happen to me if I went with him. How old were you at this time? 13. I'd just turned 13 3 weeks before. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Peters let it settle before continuing. What did you do? I ran. When Vernon went to check his horses, I just ran as fast as I could. I didn't have a plan or know where to go. I just knew I couldn't get in that wagon. Tears started down her cheeks, but her voice remained clear. I walked all night until I saw Mr. Cole's barn. I thought I'd hide for a few hours and then keep going. But he found me, and he promised to help me, and he kept that promise even when it was dangerous. Thornton's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned whether Mara truly understood what had been arranged, suggested she'd been dramatic and childish in her response, implied that her testimony had been coached by Catherine Walsh and Ethan Cole to serve their own agendas. He pointed out that many girls married young in the territories, and Mara's age wasn't unusual. He emphasized that her father had legal authority to arrange her marriage, and she had no legal standing to refuse. But Mara didn't break. She answered each question with simple truth, and when Thornton tried to twist her words, she corrected him calmly. When he suggested she'd misunderstood Vernon's intentions, she looked directly at the jury and said, I understood perfectly. He bought me like you'd buy a horse, and he was going to use me the same way. I was 13 years old, and I wasn't confused about any of it. The jury's expressions suggested Thornton's aggressive tactics had backfired. Several jurors were looking at him with visible distaste, and one woman had tears in her eyes as she watched Mara maintain her composure under attack. When Mara was finally excused, Catherine immediately went to her, wrapping her in a protective embrace and guiding her from the courtroom. Ethan wanted to follow, to make sure she was all right, but his name was being called. It was his turn to testify. The walk to the witness stand felt impossibly long. Ethan was sworn in, settled into the chair, and tried to calm his racing heart as Peters approached with his careful, methodical questions. He described the evening Mara had appeared in his barn, the terror in her eyes, the bruises on her arms, the desperate way she'd begged for help. He recounted her exact words about being too young to be a wife, about running before Vernon could hurt her, about her father selling her to settle a debt. He explained his decision to shelter her, the confrontation with Crow, the threats and intimidation that followed. Why did you help her? Peters asked. You didn't know this child. She wasn't your responsibility. Why risk everything for a stranger? Ethan thought about all the complicated reasons, all the layers of grief and redemption and choosing to care about something beyond his own pain. But when he spoke, he kept it simple. Because she was a child asking for help. Because what was being done to her was wrong. Because if I'd sent her away and something happened to her, I couldn't have lived with myself. He paused. My wife died 3 years ago, along with our son. I spent those years hiding from life because I was scared of getting hurt again. Then Mara showed up, and I realized that being scared wasn't a good enough reason to let a child be harmed. So I helped her, that's all. Thornton's cross-examination tried to suggest impropriety in Ethan's relationship with Mara, questioned why a widower would take such personal interest in a young girl, implied there might be unsavory motivations behind his protection. Each insinuation made Ethan's anger spike, but he remembered Margaret Hartwell's advice and kept his voice level, his answers direct. I helped her because it was the right thing to do. If you're trying to suggest something inappropriate, you're wrong and you're wasting the court's time. That child needed protection, and I provided it. Nothing more, nothing less. But you did develop an attachment to her, didn't you? Visited her regularly in town, brought her gifts. I checked on her welfare, yes. The same way I'd check on any child who'd been through trauma. The same way any decent person would. Ethan's voice hardened despite his efforts at control. If you're confused about why someone would care about a child's well-being without ulterior motives, that says more about you than it does about me. Judge Hartwell interrupted before Thornton could respond. Counselor, unless you have evidence to support these implications, move on to relevant questions. The rest of the cross-examination focused on the events themselves, trying to find inconsistencies in Ethan's account or suggesting he'd exaggerated the danger to Mara. But Ethan's testimony remained consistent with what he'd told Marshall Garrett months ago, with what Mara had just testified, with the physical evidence of the marriage contract and the subsequent investigation. When he was finally excused, Ethan felt drained and furious. He understood that aggressive defense tactics were part of the legal system, but having his motivations questioned, his grief exploited, his simple act of human decency twisted into something suspicious, it left him feeling soiled and angry. Catherine found him in the hallway outside the courtroom. "Mara's asking for you. She's very upset about what Thornton implied." He found Mara in a small waiting room, her face blotchy from crying. When she saw him, she jumped up and hugged him fiercely. "I'm so sorry," she said into his chest. "I'm so sorry they said those terrible things about you. None of it's true and everyone knows it, but they said it anyway and—" "Mara." Ethan gently pushed her back so he could see her face. "Those lawyers are doing their job, which is to create doubt and confusion. They're not interested in truth, just in winning. But the jury saw through it. I could tell from their faces. And even if they hadn't, it wouldn't change anything. I'd still have helped you. I'd still testify. I'd still do everything exactly the same. But your reputation? My reputation survived 3 years of self-imposed isolation and people calling me a hermit. It'll survive a lawyer making baseless implications." He squeezed her shoulders. "We did the hard part. We told the truth. Now we let the jury decide if truth still matters." The trial continued for 3 more days. Benjamin Hutchins testified, confirming that Crow had manipulated him into signing the marriage contract, that he'd been desperate and made a terrible choice, that he'd never actually asked Mara if she consented. His testimony was damaging to Crow because it came from someone who had every reason to defend the arrangement but chose honesty instead. Catherine Walsh testified about territorial law regarding parental authority and marriage contracts, citing cases where similar arrangements had been ruled invalid. Deputy Barnes testified about the confrontation at Ethan's ranch and Crow's clear intention to take Mara by force if necessary. The other families whose daughters had been similarly traded to settle debts told their stories, creating a pattern that was impossible to dismiss as isolated misunderstanding. Crow's defense presented character witnesses who praised his business acumen and charitable works, suggested that frontier marriage customs were being unfairly judged by Eastern standards, argued that parental authority over children was fundamental to family structure, but it felt hollow against the weight of testimony from the victims themselves. In his closing argument, Peters spoke directly to the jury about what this case represented. "This isn't about business contracts or frontier customs or parental authority. This is about whether a child can be sold to settle her father's debts, whether a 13-year-old girl has any right to refuse being given to a man 3 times her age, whether money and power give someone the right to treat human beings as property." He gestured toward where Mara sat with Catherine. "That young girl had the courage to run, to seek help, to stand up in this courtroom and tell you exactly what happened to her. She didn't ask to be born to a father who valued debt settlement over her welfare. She didn't choose to be traded like livestock, but she did choose to fight for her own dignity and future, and she's asking you to recognize that her life, her body, her choices matter more than Silas Crow's business arrangements." Thornton's closing was technically proficient, arguing reasonable doubt and legal precedent and the danger of federal overreach into family matters. But it lacked the moral weight of Peter's argument, and Ethan could see several jurors had already made up their minds. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Ethan spent that time in the hotel with Mara and Catherine, trying to distract themselves with cards and conversation, failing completely. When word came that the jury had reached a verdict, they rushed back to the courthouse, taking their seats in a gallery now packed with spectators who'd come to witness the conclusion of a trial that had captured the territory's attention. Judge Hartwell called the court to order and asked for the verdict. The jury foreman stood, a weathered rancher from outside Billings who'd sat through every moment of testimony with careful attention. "On the charge of human trafficking, we find the defendant Silas Crow guilty. On the charge of fraud in business practices, guilty. On the charge of witness intimidation through arson, guilty. On all charges related to the exploitation of minors through debt bondage, guilty." The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered, others gasped. Journalists scrambled to get the verdict to their newspapers first. Crow's face went white, then red, his hands gripping the defense table as if it was the only thing keeping him upright. Vernon Crowe stood abruptly and tried to leave, but marshals blocked the doors. He too would face charges, though his trial was scheduled separately. Judge Hartwell gavelled for order. When the noise finally subsided, he addressed Crowe directly. Mr. Crowe, you used your economic power to exploit vulnerable families and treat children as commodities. You created a system where debt became a tool for control and where those who couldn't pay were forced to surrender what should never be for sale, the welfare and bodily autonomy of their own children. The jury has found you guilty of serious federal crimes, and I agree with their verdict. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. You will be sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Additionally, your business assets will be liquidated to compensate your victims and pay restitution. Any contracts related to the schemes described in this trial are hereby declared void and unenforceable. More gasps and murmurs. 15 years was a significant sentence, and the asset liquidation meant Crowe's empire was finished. He'd go to prison a powerful man and emerge, if he survived the sentence, as nothing. As marshals led Crowe away, Ethan watched the man who'd threatened him, burned his barn, tried to destroy his life for the crime of protecting a child. Crowe's eyes found Ethan's in the crowd, and for a moment pure hatred flashed between them. Then he was gone, led through a side door toward the jail where he'd await transfer to federal prison. Outside the courthouse, the autumn sun was setting, painting the billing sky in shades of orange and gold. Mara stood on the courthouse steps, Catherine's arm around her shoulders, and watched people celebrate the verdict around them. Ethan saw tears streaming down her face, but they carried relief rather than sadness. "It's really over," she said when he joined them. "He can't hurt me anymore, can't hurt anyone anymore." "It's really over," Ethan confirmed. "You're free, Mara. Free to grow up on your own terms, make your own choices, become whoever you want to be." The three of them stood together as the celebration continued around them, a moment of quiet acknowledgement in the midst of noise. They'd been through something profound together, had fought for justice when it would have been easier to look away, had trusted that truth and courage and community could prevail against power and money and threats. The journey back to their territory was lighter, the weight of uncertainty finally lifted. They talked about what came next, Mara continuing her education, maybe eventually going to a normal school in a larger town where she could pursue whatever interested her. Catherine mentioned that she'd been thinking about expanding the boarding house, maybe hiring Mara officially once she was old enough to work legally. Ethan found himself talking about his ranch, about maybe taking on an apprentice or hiring seasonal help, about not spending quite so much time alone with his grief. When they finally reached town in Catherine's boarding house, Mara hugged Ethan goodbye with fierce gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for believing me, for protecting me, for standing up even when it was dangerous. You saved my life." "You saved mine too," Ethan replied honestly. "You reminded me that life is about more than just surviving, that sometimes you have to care about something beyond your own pain, that doing the right thing matters even when it's hard." In the months that followed, life settled into new patterns. Ethan's ranch prospered, his cattle thriving, and his modest operation growing steadily. He'd taken Jack Morrison's advice and become more involved in community affairs, serving on a committee to improve roads, helping organize a school expansion fund, even attending church socials where he'd discovered that conversation with neighbors didn't have to hurt. Mara flourished in school, her quick mind and determination making up for lost time. She'd found particular talent in mathematics and science, subjects that challenged her in ways she clearly relished. Catherine reported that Mara had started talking about maybe becoming a teacher herself someday, or possibly studying law like Margaret Hartwell, wanting to help other children who found themselves in impossible situations. The trial had sparked broader conversations across the territory about children's rights, parental authority, and the need for clearer laws protecting minors from exploitation. Several territorial legislators had proposed reforms inspired by the Crowe case, and Catherine had been invited to testify before the territorial legislature about what changes were needed. The ripples from one girl's desperate flight had spread farther than anyone had imagined. Vernon Crowe's trial ended in a similar verdict to his uncle's, though his sentence was lighter, 8 years. Benjamin Hutchins had faced charges too, but his cooperation with the prosecution and genuine remorse had resulted in a suspended sentence and probation. He'd left the territory entirely. Word was he'd gone to California to start over somewhere his past wasn't known. Mara had mixed feelings about her father leaving, but Ethan thought it was probably for the best. Some relationships were too damaged to repair, and Mara deserved to move forward without the weight of that particular hurt. On a clear spring morning, nearly a year after Mara had first appeared in his barn, Ethan rode into town for a special occasion. Mara was graduating from the initial stage of her education, moving up to the advanced class for older students. It was a small ceremony held in the schoolhouse, but Catherine had insisted Ethan attend, and he'd agreed without hesitation. He sat in the back row with other proud families as Miss Brennan called each student forward to receive their certificate. When Mara's name was called, she walked to the front with confidence Ethan never could have imagined in that terrified child hiding behind hay bales. She'd grown taller. Her face had lost its haunted thinness, and her eyes carried hope instead of fear. After the ceremony, there was cake and lemonade, children running between the adults, parents congratulating their students. Ethan found Mara standing near the window, looking out at the town that had become her home. "Proud of you," he said, joining her. "Thank you, and thank you for coming." She held up her certificate. "This is because of you, because you gave me the chance to have a normal life instead of—" She didn't finish, but they both knew what she meant. "You did this yourself. You worked hard, caught up, made friends, built a future. I just kept you safe long enough for you to do the rest." Mara turned from the window to face him fully. "Do you remember what you told me that first night? That some things are just wrong no matter what papers say?" "I remember. I think about that a lot. How you knew that truth without having to check law books or ask permission. You just knew that what was happening to me was wrong, and you acted on it." Her expression turned serious. "I want to be like that. I want to be someone who sees wrong and does something about it instead of looking away because it's easier or safer. That's what you taught me." Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion. This brave, brilliant girl who'd survived so much and emerged not broken but stronger, not bitter but determined to help others. She represented everything good that could come from choosing courage over comfort. "Then you've learned the most important lesson there is," he said quietly, "and you'll make the world better for being in it." They stood together in the schoolhouse, surrounded by celebration and community, and Ethan thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that terrified night in the barn to this moment of accomplishment and hope, from isolation and grief to connection and purpose. The cost had been high: a burned barn, threats and intimidation, the exposure of painful memories in a courtroom. But the result was a child given back her future and a man given back his life. Sarah would have liked Mara, Ethan thought, would have been proud of what he'd done, proud of how he'd finally stepped back into the world instead of hiding from it. The grief of losing Sarah and their son would never fully disappear, but it had transformed into something that could coexist with joy and purpose and the knowledge that life continued to offer chances at redemption if you were brave enough to take them. As the sun set that evening and Ethan rode back to his ranch, he passed the spot where Mara had first appeared in his barn doorway, desperate and terrified and hoping against hope that a stranger might help. He'd been given a choice in that moment, to turn away or to stand up, to protect his careful isolation or to risk everything for someone who needed him. He'd chosen to stand up, and that choice had changed everything, not just for Mara, but for himself, for the community that had rallied around them, for the other families who'd been freed from Crow's schemes. One decision, made in a moment when it would have been easier to look away, had rippled outward in ways he never could have predicted. The new barn stood solid and strong in the twilight, built by community hands as a testament to what people could create when they chose to support rather than abandon each other. Ethan's cattle grazed peacefully in the pasture. The house that had been a tomb of grief had become simply a home again. And somewhere in town, a young girl who'd once been sold like property was dreaming about her future, secure in the knowledge that there were people who'd fought to give her the chance to have one. Ethan Cole had learned that doing what's right didn't always lead to easy outcomes, that standing up to power came with costs, that justice was never guaranteed. But he'd also learned that isolation wasn't safety, that community mattered, that sometimes one person's courage could inspire others to find their own. That in a harsh world where money and power often prevailed, there were still moments when simple human decency could win. As he settled into bed that night, Ethan felt a peace he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. Not the numbness of grief, but the warmth of connection. He'd been given a second chance at life by a desperate child who'd stumbled into his barn asking for help. He'd taken that chance, paid its price, and discovered that on the other side of fear and risk, and choosing to care again was something worth having. A life that mattered, choices that counted, a future built on the simple principle that when you had the power to help someone, you had the obligation to do so. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.